Welcome to the channel. Today, we're taking a quiet step back into the past, into the heart of feudal Japan, to explore the life and legacy of the shogun. For over 700 years, the shogun stood as the true power behind the throne. While emperors held symbolic status, it was the shoguns who ruled the land, commanded armies, and maintained order across a divided country. But how did this role come to exist? What kind of person became a shogun? And what was life like, not just in battle, but in the quiet halls of their castles, among political advisors, and within the delicate rhythms of courtly life? In this video, we'll look at how the shogunate began, how power was won and kept, and what daily life looked like for those who led Japan from behind the scenes. That it's a story of discipline, duty, and control, of lives shaped by both warfare and peace. Let's begin our journey. Chapter 1. Origins of the Samurai Class. The history of the samurai begins in the twilight of the Heian period, 794 to 1185, a time when imperial power in Japan was waning and provincial military clans were on the rise. Initially, the term referred to those who served, referring broadly to warriors who pledged loyalty to aristocrats or local landholders. These early warriors were not yet the culturally refined figures of later centuries, but were pragmatic enforcers. Mounted archers and land protectors engaged in local skirmishes across rural regions. During the 9th and 10th centuries, the imperial court in the capital struggled to govern distant provinces. As a result, wealthy landowners began hiring private security forces to protect their holdings. These private militias evolved into the warrior elite, who were bound by personal loyalty, family ties, and martial prowess. Unlike the nobility, who relied on inherited power and ceremonial culture, these early warriors earned their status through battle and service. Two powerful clans rose above the rest. Their rivalry culminated in a brutal civil conflict that reshaped the political landscape of the country. The victorious side established the first military government in 1192, marking the beginning of the feudal era. The emperor remained a symbolic figure, while real power was held by the military government and its ruling class. This shift transformed the warrior from a hired sword into a member of the ruling class. Warriors began receiving land and titles in exchange for service, creating a reciprocal bond between lord and vassal that would shape national politics for centuries. During the ensuing period, these warriors formed the backbone of the military government, defending the nation from internal rebellion and external threats, including the invasions by foreign empires in the late 13th century. The invasions of 1274 and 1281 were pivotal. Though the warriors were initially unprepared for the invaders' advanced tactics and weaponry, they adapted quickly. The invasions were ultimately repelled with the help of typhoons, natural disasters which destroyed much of the enemy fleets. These events reinforced a belief in the divine protection of the land and elevated the warriors' status as defenders of the nation. Throughout the following period, the warrior class became more deeply entwined in politics, culture, and philosophy. They formed strategic alliances with religious institutions, engaged in artistic rituals, and adopted codes of conduct that emphasized loyalty, self-discipline, and martial virtue. This era also saw the rise of regional lords and the fragmentation of centralized power, leading to a chaotic period marked by civil war. As warfare became more organized, the warriors' role shifted from loosely affiliated fighters to disciplined soldiers serving powerful regional rulers. Armor evolved, tactics were refined, and castle construction boomed. The romanticized image of the warrior was solidified in this era, blending brutality with philosophical depth, aesthetic sensibility, and absolute loyalty. The origins of the warrior class, then, lie not in a singular moment, but in centuries of political strife, social change, and cultural evolution. From humble beginnings as provincial enforcers to lords of war and ultimately bureaucrats, these warriors were shaped by, and in turn shaped, the history of the nation. Chapter 2. Early life and training of a warrior. The path to becoming a warrior in medieval Japan began at birth, and the process was rigorous and deeply embedded in societal expectations. Children born into warrior families were expected to uphold the family's honor and continue its martial legacy. Their early life was shaped by strict discipline, social hierarchies, and a deep immersion in military tradition. Boys destined to become warriors began their training as early as the age of 5. At this tender age, physical exercise, horseback riding, and mock combat became central to their daily routine. This training was not just about preparing for battle, but about instilling mental resilience, discipline, and an understanding of the warrior code from a young age. Honor, obedience, and loyalty to one's lord and family were stressed above all else. Education was also a crucial part of their upbringing. While martial skills took precedence, young warriors were taught literature, calligraphy, history, and ethics. These subjects were meant to refine their character and ensure that they would grow not only into competent fighters, but into respectable and wise leaders. They were expected to understand strategy, philosophy, and even poetry, as these disciplines were considered essential to a complete warrior. Daily life in a warrior household revolved around structure and duty. Boys were often awakened at dawn for physical training, which included archery, sword practice, and endurance drills. Mealtimes were strictly scheduled and consisted of simple but nutritious fare: rice, fish, miso soup, pickled vegetables, and seasonal greens. These meals were intended to maintain physical strength and were consumed with ritualistic respect. In their early years, young warriors were warned of the dangers of excess and indulgence. They were taught to avoid laziness, overconsumption, dishonesty, and any behavior that might tarnish the family name. Moderation was expected, and young boys were closely monitored by elders and instructors who corrected any deviation from the expected path. As they matured, these boys participated in increasingly complex training. They were taught how to care for their armor and weapons, how to read the terrain of a battlefield, and how to anticipate an opponent's movements. Wrestling and hand-to-hand combat were also important components of their education, as these skills could be decisive in close combat situations. Mentorship played a vital role in this process. Experienced warriors took younger ones under their wing, guiding them not just in the ways of battle, but in personal conduct, ethics, and loyalty. These mentor-student relationships were deeply personal and could last a lifetime, often forming bonds as strong as blood ties. Ceremonies marked important milestones in a young warrior's life. At around the age of 15, a boy would undergo a formal rite of passage, signifying his transition into adulthood and readiness for real combat. From this point forward, he was expected to carry himself with full responsibility and live by the warrior code. Training never truly ended. Even seasoned warriors continued to practice daily, refine their techniques, and study the teachings of military classics. They participated in duels, reviewed tactics, and remained ever vigilant, as peace was often fleeting and conflict always a looming possibility. The early life of a warrior, therefore, was not one of leisure or privilege, but of relentless preparation, self-discipline, and moral education. From childhood through adulthood, they were forged in the fires of tradition, expectation, and ever-present danger. This foundation was essential, for only those who truly lived the way of the warrior could hope to serve with honor, achieve distinction, and uphold their family's legacy in the harsh and demanding world of medieval warfare. Chapter 3. Daily life and routine of a warrior. The life of a professional warrior in medieval Japan was not defined solely by battle and strategy, but also by the rhythm of daily life that maintained their discipline, order, and purpose. While their martial duties often dominate historical narratives, the more mundane aspects of life played a significant role in shaping the enduring character of the warrior class. From early morning rituals to evening reflection, every moment was governed by routine and principle. Warriors typically rose at dawn. The morning began with a series of personal grooming and spiritual activities. Cleanliness was not just a matter of hygiene, but was also seen as a reflection of inner discipline and readiness. A clean body and ordered appearance were considered essential traits of a respectable warrior. After washing and dressing in simple but finely crafted robes, warriors often engaged in morning meditation or prayer. These moments of calm focus helped center the mind for the challenges of the day. Afterward came the first meal of the day, usually consisting of steamed rice, soup, pickled vegetables, and occasionally dried or grilled fish. Meals were eaten quietly, often in the company of family members or comrades, and always with a sense of gratitude. Eating was viewed not as an indulgence, but as a necessary preparation for physical and mental tasks. Following breakfast, the day's training or assignments would begin. For warriors not actively involved in a campaign or traveling on behalf of their lord, much of the day was devoted to practicing combat techniques. Swordsmanship, archery, mounted drills, and unarmed combat formed the core of these routines. Warriors would often train under the supervision of masters or respected elders, and it was common to pair up with sparring partners to simulate real combat conditions. In addition to physical conditioning, mental refinement continued throughout the day. Reading military texts, memorizing historic battles, and studying strategy were considered as crucial as physical strength. Many warriors kept personal journals to reflect on their progress or to write down insights gained during training. Poetry and calligraphy also remained integral to their education, and afternoons might be spent honing these finer arts. Midday brought a brief respite for rest and nourishment. The midday meal mirrored breakfast in simplicity and nutritional value. Depending on the season and region, ingredients would vary, but emphasis was always placed on balance and moderation. Meals were prepared with care, often by household members or retainers trained in culinary discipline. For warriors who were in service at a noble estate or held land of their own, the afternoon might include managing administrative responsibilities. These duties ranged from supervising laborers and collecting taxes to resolving disputes among peasants or coordinating defense plans. Even the most battle-hardened warrior was expected to be a capable steward of land and people. Evenings were often more relaxed but remained guided by order. After bathing and changing into more comfortable attire, warriors would again spend time with family or mentors. Discussions around the hearth often covered philosophical matters, tactical ideas, or moral dilemmas. These conversations were not idle talk. They were seen as opportunities for sharpening the intellect and reinforcing moral frameworks. At night, a final meal would be shared, usually lighter than the earlier meals. Then came a period of quiet reflection, writing, or prayer. Many warriors believed in ending the day with a clear mind and a grateful heart, regardless of the trials encountered. The belief in impermanence, the idea that life was fleeting, encouraged warriors to live each day with purpose and dignity. The home of a warrior was built to reflect his values. Clean lines, minimal ornamentation, and natural materials dominated the architecture. Rooms were typically sparse but functional, emphasizing the warrior's rejection of luxury and focus on utility. Weapons were displayed not as decorations but as symbols of duty and readiness. Sleep was considered a preparation for tomorrow's duty. Bedding was simple, and the household quieted early. A warrior's day, structured and purposeful, aimed to harmonize body, mind, and spirit. Over time, this daily rhythm forged individuals of exceptional discipline and clarity, able to act decisively in moments of chaos because they had trained themselves to master each moment of calm. The daily life of a warrior, then, was a lifelong ritual, an ongoing practice of self-mastery. In peace as in war, their commitment to routine, reflection, and refinement was what truly set them apart. Their greatness was not just measured on the battlefield, but in the quiet, consistent choices they made each day to uphold their code, support their communities, and refine their character. Chapter 4. Diet, Health, and Physical Conditioning. A warrior's health was of utmost importance, and the discipline surrounding diet and physical conditioning was integral to maintaining peak performance both in and out of combat. The strength, endurance, and mental clarity of a warrior were directly tied to what they consumed and how they maintained their bodies. To achieve the ideal balance of agility, stamina, and power, warriors followed dietary habits and exercise regimens that were shaped by centuries of tradition, observation, and necessity. The daily diet of a warrior was simple, yet carefully planned. Meals centered around rice, the primary source of energy. To this were added seasonal vegetables, fermented foods like pickles, and proteins such as fish, poultry, or occasionally tofu and eggs. Meat from larger animals was consumed less frequently, both due to cultural restrictions and practical limitations. The simplicity of the diet was not due to lack of resources, but by design. It aimed to provide consistent, digestible fuel without excess. portion control was fundamental. Overeating was seen as a form of indulgence and a sign of weak discipline. Meals were often portioned based on the warrior's level of physical activity, with a heavier intake following rigorous training or a day of travel. Liquids were consumed in moderation, mostly water or weakly brewed tea, which helped with digestion and hydration without leading to sluggishness that in times of war. Food supplies could be unpredictable. Warriors adapted by learning how to ration dried rice, salted fish, and preserved vegetables. They carried compact field meals that could sustain them during marches or sieges. These rations, while bland, were efficient and allowed them to stay combat-ready even during prolonged campaigns. Survival training often included how to find or prepare food in wilderness areas using local flora and fauna. Physical conditioning was a daily obligation. Warriors engaged in early morning and evening exercises designed to increase strength, flexibility, and balance. Sword drills, archery practice, horseback riding, and hand-to-hand combat formed the backbone of these sessions. Many also practiced forms of breathing and body awareness to enhance reaction time and internal calm. Physical conditioning was not limited to combat skills. Warriors also ran long distances, climbed, swam, and lifted weights, sometimes using stones or wooden logs, to build functional strength. Each movement and method had been refined over generations to serve specific combat roles. For instance, maintaining balance while wearing armor or drawing a bow with precision required targeted strength and practiced control. Health was also closely linked to hygiene. Regular bathing was not just for cleanliness, but seen as essential to removing impurities from the body and spirit. Warriors believed that a clean body helped to maintain a sharp mind. Public and private baths were part of daily life, and sick warriors were often prescribed rest, special diets, or herbal remedies to restore balance. Knowledge of natural medicine, including local herbs and healing practices, was a respected skill among veteran warriors. Injury prevention and recovery were key concerns. Muscle strains, bruises, and cuts were common, and warriors learned to treat minor wounds with salves, poultices, and bandages. Massage and stretching were used not only for healing, but to prevent stiffness and maintain fluid movement. If more serious injuries occurred, recovery was taken seriously, and a warrior would not return to the field until fully capable. Mental health, though not discussed in modern terms, was deeply valued. Warriors were trained to master fear, endure suffering, and suppress unproductive emotion. Meditation, poetry, nature walks, and time spent in shrines or quiet places were forms of mental reset. Isolation during recovery was sometimes used as a way to reconnect with personal discipline and reflect on one's path. An aging warrior did not necessarily retire, but adapted his routine. While no longer expected to fight on the front lines, older warriors served as instructors, mentors, and advisors. Their health routines evolved to preserve mobility and clarity rather than brute strength. They remained respected members of the community and often continued training in less strenuous forms. Altogether, the warrior's approach to health was holistic. Mind and body were inseparable, and the daily rituals of diet and conditioning were treated with as much respect as swordsmanship or strategy. A well-kept body, just like a well-kept weapon, was a mark of honor and readiness. Through centuries of refinement, these practices contributed to the remarkable endurance, resilience, and presence of the warrior class. Chapter 5. Education, Literacy, and the Cultivation of Wisdom. Contrary to the popular perception of the warrior as a figure of brute force alone, education and intellectual development were essential components of the warrior's identity. From a young age, warriors were expected to be literate, articulate, and well-versed in subjects that extended far beyond the battlefield. The cultivation of wisdom was considered a powerful weapon, one that ensured sound leadership, strategic foresight, and moral integrity. Reading and writing were introduced early in a warrior's education. They were taught to read classic texts, historical records, and military manuals. Writing, whether in the form of daily journals, letters, or philosophical essays, was a practice that refined thought and preserved the intellectual lineage of the warrior class. A skilled warrior could both wield a sword and compose a reflective passage on the impermanence of life. Literature, especially poetry and historical epics, played a vital role in shaping values and identity. Poems were more than artistic expression. They were a form of moral contemplation. Warriors often memorized poems that illustrated courage, sacrifice, or the fleeting nature of glory. Through these verses, they learned empathy, introspection, and the discipline of language. Philosophy was another cornerstone of warrior education. Ethical questions regarding loyalty, justice, and the meaning of duty were explored in depth. Warriors were taught to consider the consequences of their actions, not only in the immediate sense, but across generations. This long-term thinking guided them to act with restraint, humility, and honor. Military strategy was studied both theoretically and through practical application. Warriors examined past battles, analyzed formations, and discussed the psychology of opponents. They learned how terrain, weather, and morale could determine outcomes. Some of the greatest generals of the era were celebrated as much for their wisdom as for their victories. Mathematics and land management were also part of the curriculum, especially for those expected to govern territory or manage an estate. Warriors needed to understand accounting, logistics, and agricultural cycles to support their households and lead their retainers effectively. Competence in administration was a hallmark of a mature and trustworthy warrior, religious and moral. Teachings further enriched their education. Warriors studied sacred texts and were taught the importance of humility, compassion, and self-awareness. While religion served a spiritual function, it also provided a moral framework for decision-making in moments of doubt or conflict. Ceremonial duties and rituals, often performed with precise decorum, reminded warriors of their connection to tradition and the greater order of the world. Music and visual arts, though less emphasized, were not excluded. Some warriors played instruments or painted as a form of personal balance. These activities fostered patience and fine motor control, skills transferable to martial practice. Appreciation for beauty was not seen as indulgent, but as part of a complete human experience. The warrior-scholar ideal was deeply respected. Elders who could recite ancient verses or interpret philosophical texts held considerable authority. Their knowledge was seen as an extension of their strength, and their advice was sought in matters both political and personal. Learning, like swordsmanship, required a lifetime of dedication. Education was not reserved solely for men. In some households, women of the warrior class were taught to read, write, and manage estates. While societal expectations differed, the principle that wisdom elevated character applied across gender. Families took pride in their intellectual legacy as much as their martial heritage. Thus, the path of the warrior was not only one of action, but of contemplation. Study was an armor of the mind, shielding against ignorance and impulse. The pursuit of wisdom, through books, dialogue, and introspection, completed the transformation of a young fighter into a well-rounded leader. Knowledge, like the sword, was honed through discipline and wielded with purpose. In this harmony of mind and body, the true strength of the warrior class was revealed. Chapter 6. Weapons, Armor, and the Art of War. No aspect of the warrior's identity was more iconic or essential than his tools of war. The mastery of weapons and the development of armor were not only practical concerns, but symbolic ones, expressing a warrior's status, discipline, and role in society. Each weapon, each piece of armor, told a story of personal skill, technological innovation, and centuries of martial tradition. The primary weapon of the warrior was the sword. Forged through complex, layered methods, the sword was valued not just for its cutting edge, but for its balance, resilience, and aesthetic quality. Possessing a fine sword was considered a mark of honor, and caring for it was both a daily duty and a spiritual practice. Warriors often named their swords, regarded them with reverence, and passed them down through generations. A sword was not simply a weapon. It was an extension of the warrior's soul. Though the sword gained mythic status, it was not the only weapon in the warrior's arsenal. Spears, bows, and later, polearms were essential for battle. The bow was especially important in earlier periods, when warriors fought on horseback and relied on ranged attacks to gain the upper hand. Precision, timing, and control were critical in archery, and warriors spent countless hours perfecting their aim and breath control. Spears were used extensively in open battle. They allowed for reach and power, especially against cavalry. As formations and tactics evolved, the spear became a common battlefield weapon, often used in coordinated groups. Polearms, with their varied blade types, added versatility and were effective in both defense and offense, particularly when fighting against armor. In time, with the introduction of foreign firearms, warriors had to adapt. Although many resisted, the use of guns due to their lack of elegance and the shift they represented, practical leaders began incorporating them into military strategy. However, the core identity of the warrior remained closely tied to bladed weapons, even as tactics evolved. Armor developed in tandem with weaponry. Early armor prioritized mobility, using layers of cloth and leather, reinforced with metal plates. As weapons became more powerful, so too did the armor. By the peak of the warrior era, armor included solid breastplates, shoulder guards, helmets, and face masks designed to protect vital areas while allowing movement. Armor was often customized for the individual warrior, balancing weight and flexibility today. Warrior's helmet, often adorned with crests or symbols, served both protective and psychological functions. In battle, these crests helped identify allies and inspired fear or awe in enemies. Helmets were lined for comfort and fitted to ensure they would not shift or fall during a charge. Maintaining armor was a daily task. Rust, weakness in stitching, or loose fittings could prove fatal. Warriors learned to care for their gear themselves, inspecting every joint and strap. This maintenance was a form of meditation, reinforcing a sense of personal responsibility and readiness. Combat techniques were studied formally in martial schools. These schools taught specific styles of swordplay, grappling, spear use, and later, techniques for dealing with firearms. Each school emphasized a different philosophy. Some favored aggression and directness, others focused on timing, redirection, and precision. Warriors often studied multiple schools over their lifetimes, adapting what worked best for their body type and mindset. Dueling was another key element of warrior culture. Though not as common as popular stories suggest, duels were a means to resolve disputes, defend honor, or test one's skills. These contests were governed by strict rules and observed by witnesses. Victory brought prestige, but recklessness was frowned upon. True warriors fought with purpose, not vanity. Discipline in combat was paramount. Warriors were trained to control their emotions in the heat of battle, to remain focused and efficient even in the face of chaos. Group tactics, formations, and battlefield communication required trust and coordination. A successful warrior was not only a master of his own body and weapons, but a loyal and competent part of a larger force. Ultimately, the art of war was more than fighting. It was a blend of strategy, presence, and mastery. Weapons and armor were not merely tools of destruction, but instruments of identity, training, and culture. Through their constant refinement and respectful use, the warrior upheld a tradition that honored both life and death, strength and restraint, power and wisdom. Chapter 7. Loyalty, Honor, and the Warrior Code. The heart of the warrior's life was not his weapon or his skill, but his unwavering adherence to a code of conduct. Loyalty, honor, duty, and sacrifice were not abstract ideals. They were lived values that governed every choice a warrior made. These principles were passed down through family teachings, military training, and personal observation, shaping the ethical core of the warrior class. Loyalty was paramount. A warrior's allegiance to his lord was sacred and unconditional. This loyalty extended beyond convenience or circumstance. It was meant to withstand hardship, defeat, and even personal loss. To betray one's lord was not merely treason. It was a moral collapse. Conversely, a lord was expected to protect and support his vassals. This mutual responsibility formed the backbone of feudal society. Honor was both internal and external. Internally, it demanded that a warrior act with integrity, bravery, and restraint. Externally, honor was reflected in how one was seen by peers, family, and superiors. A single act of cowardice or deceit could bring shame not only to the individual but to the entire household. Reputation was hard-won and jealously guarded. The concept of duty included service to one's family, community, and heritage. Warriors, were expected to place the needs of the group above personal desires. Whether managing land, mentoring young fighters, or leading troops, duty required a blend of humility and resolve. Every action was measured against its alignment with greater responsibilities. Sacrifice was the natural consequence of these values. A true warrior was prepared to give his life without hesitation if it served a righteous cause or protected those he was sworn to defend. Death was not feared if it was honorable. In fact, choosing to live in dishonor was often considered a greater disgrace than dying with purpose. Ceremonial rituals reinforced these values. Warriors participated in rites that celebrated loyalty, commemorated fallen comrades, and symbolized commitment to the code. These rituals, often performed before battle, helped warriors focus their minds and reaffirm their place within the order of society. Stories of historical figures who exemplified loyalty and sacrifice were told and retold. These narratives served as moral instruction and cultural preservation. Warriors were expected to learn from these examples, using them as guides for conduct in their own lives. Shame and redemption were also parts of this moral framework. If a warrior failed in his duty, he was expected to acknowledge the failure, accept the consequences, and, if possible, restore his honor through acts of bravery or self-discipline. The path to redemption was difficult but not closed in everyday interactions. Warriors were courteous, measured, and respectful. They avoided boasting, idle threats, or unnecessary violence. The true measure of a warrior was found not in how he fought, but in how he lived when the sword was sheathed. This quiet strength and sense of responsibility earned the respect of peers and superiors alike. Instruction in the warrior code was not confined to formal settings. Parents, mentors, and commanders all contributed to this moral education. Young warriors were constantly reminded that their actions reflected on their family, their ancestors, and their future descendants. Over time, this code became a defining feature of the warrior identity. It was more than a rulebook, it was a way of life, a set of values that offered clarity in confusion and courage in fear. The code provided a moral compass that guided warriors through the chaos of politics, war, and personal trials in a world often marked by conflict and shifting allegiances. The constancy of the warrior code stood as a stabilizing force. It demanded much of those who followed it, but in return, it gave them purpose, pride, and peace of mind. It is this deep commitment to principle that continues to define the legacy of the warrior class across history. Chapter 6. Weapons, Armor, and the Art of War. No aspect of the warrior's identity was more iconic or essential than his tools of war. The mastery of weapons and the development of armor were not only practical concerns, but symbolic ones, expressing a warrior's status, discipline, and role in society. Each weapon, each piece of armor, told a story of personal skill, technological innovation, and centuries of martial tradition. The primary weapon of the warrior was the sword. Forged through complex, layered methods, the sword was valued not just for its cutting edge, but for its balance, resilience, and aesthetic quality. Possessing a fine sword was considered a mark of honor, and caring for it was both a daily duty and a spiritual practice. Warriors often named their swords, regarded them with reverence, and passed them down through generations. A sword was not simply a weapon. It was an extension of the warrior's soul. Though the sword gained mythic status, it was not the only weapon in the warrior's arsenal. Spears, bows, and later, polearms were essential for battle. The bow was especially important in earlier periods, when warriors fought on horseback and relied on ranged attacks to gain the upper hand. Precision, timing, and control were critical in archery, and warriors spent countless hours perfecting their aim and breath control. Spears were used extensively in open battle. They allowed for reach and power, especially against cavalry. As formations and tactics evolved, the spear became a common battlefield weapon, often used in coordinated groups. Polearms, with their varied blade types, added versatility and were effective in both defense and offense, particularly when fighting against armor. In time, with the introduction of foreign firearms, warriors had to adapt. Although many resisted the use of guns due to their lack of elegance and the shift they represented, practical leaders began incorporating them into military strategy. However, The core identity of the warrior remained closely tied to bladed weapons, even as tactics evolved. Armor developed in tandem with weaponry. Early armor prioritized mobility, using layers of cloth and leather reinforced with metal plates. As weapons became more powerful, so too did the armor. By the peak of the warrior era, armor included solid breastplates, shoulder guards, helmets, and face masks designed to protect vital areas while allowing movement. Armor was often customized for the individual warrior, balancing weight and flexibility today. Warrior's helmet, often adorned with crests or symbols, served both protective and psychological functions. In battle, these crests helped identify allies and inspired fear or awe in enemies. Helmets were lined for comfort and fitted to ensure they would not shift or fall during a charge. Maintaining armor was a daily task. Rust, weakness in stitching, or loose fittings could prove fatal. Warriors learned to care for their gear themselves, inspecting every joint and strap. This maintenance was a form of meditation, reinforcing a sense of personal responsibility and readiness. Combat techniques were studied formally in martial schools. These schools taught specific styles of swordplay, grappling, spear use, and later, techniques for dealing with firearms. Each school emphasized a different philosophy. Some favored aggression and directness, others focused on timing, redirection, and precision. Warriors often studied multiple schools over their lifetimes, adapting what worked best for their body type and mindset. Dueling was another key element of warrior culture. Though not as common as popular stories suggest, duels were a means to resolve disputes, defend honor, or test one's skills. These contests were governed by strict rules and observed by witnesses. Victory brought prestige, but recklessness was frowned upon. True warriors fought with purpose, not vanity. Discipline in combat was paramount. Warriors were trained to control their emotions in the heat of battle, to remain focused and efficient even in the face of chaos. Group tactics, formations, and battlefield communication required trust and coordination. A successful warrior was not only a master of his own body and weapons, but a loyal and competent part of a larger force. Ultimately, the art of war was more than fighting. It was a blend of strategy, presence, and mastery. Weapons and armor were not merely tools of destruction, but instruments of identity, training, and culture. Through their constant refinement and respectful use, the warrior upheld a tradition that honored both life and death, strength and restraint, power and wisdom. Chapter 7. Loyalty, Honor, and the Warrior Code. The heart of the warrior's life was not his weapon or his skill, but his unwavering adherence to a code of conduct. Loyalty, honor, duty, and sacrifice were not abstract ideals. They were lived values that governed every choice a warrior made. These principles were passed down through family teachings, military training, and personal observation, shaping the ethical core of the warrior class. Loyalty was paramount. A warrior's allegiance to his lord was sacred and unconditional. This loyalty extended beyond convenience or circumstance. It was meant to withstand hardship, defeat, and even personal loss. To betray one's lord was not merely treason. It was a moral collapse. Conversely, a lord was expected to protect and support his vassals. This mutual responsibility formed the backbone of feudal society. Honor was both internal and external. Internally, it demanded that a warrior act with integrity, bravery, and restraint. Externally, honor was reflected in how one was seen by peers, family, and superiors. A single act of cowardice or deceit could bring shame not only to the individual but to the entire household. Reputation was hard-won and jealously guarded. The concept of duty included service to one's family, community, and heritage. Warriors were expected to place the needs of the group above personal desires. Whether managing land, mentoring young fighters, or leading troops, duty required a blend of humility and resolve. Every action was measured against its alignment with greater responsibilities. Sacrifice was the natural consequence of these values. A true warrior was prepared to give his life without hesitation if it served a righteous cause or protected those he was sworn to defend. Death was not feared if it was honorable. In fact, choosing to live in dishonor was often considered a greater disgrace than dying with purpose. Ceremonial rituals reinforced these values. Warriors participated in rites that celebrated loyalty, commemorated fallen comrades, and symbolized commitment to the code. These rituals, often performed before battle, helped warriors focus their minds and reaffirm their place within the order of society. Stories of historical figures who exemplified loyalty and sacrifice were told and retold. These narratives served as moral instruction and cultural preservation. Warriors were expected to learn from these examples, using them as guides for conduct in their own lives. Shame and redemption were also parts of this moral framework. If a warrior failed in his duty, he was expected to acknowledge the failure, accept the consequences, and, if possible, restore his honor through acts of bravery or self-discipline. The path to redemption was difficult but not closed in everyday interactions. Warriors were courteous, measured, and respectful. They avoided boasting, idle threats, or unnecessary violence. The true measure of a warrior was found not in how he fought, but in how he lived when the sword was sheathed. This quiet strength and sense of responsibility earned the respect of peers and superiors alike. Instruction in the warrior code was not confined to formal settings. Parents, mentors, and commanders all contributed to this moral education. Young warriors were constantly reminded that their actions reflected on their family, their ancestors, and their future descendants. Over time, this code became a defining feature of the warrior identity. It was more than a rulebook, it was a way of life, a set of values that offered clarity in confusion and courage in fear. The code provided a moral compass that guided warriors through the chaos of politics, war, and personal trials in a world often marked by conflict and shifting allegiances. The constancy of the warrior code stood as a stabilizing force. It demanded much of those who followed it, but in return, it gave them purpose, pride, and peace of mind. It is this deep commitment to principle that continues to define the legacy of the warrior class across history. Chapter 10: Governance, Land Stewardship, and Bureaucratic Duty. While warriors are often remembered for their prowess in combat, their influence extended deeply into the administration of land and governance. As feudal society evolved, warriors became more than fighters. They became rulers, stewards, and bureaucrats, entrusted with the welfare of entire provinces and communities. Their responsibilities reflected not only military authority, but also political and economic acumen. A warrior who held land did so as a representative of higher lords or military rulers. This land, often awarded in recognition of service, was both a privilege and a burden. It had to be cultivated, defended, taxed, and administered. Warriors were responsible for ensuring agricultural productivity, managing local labor, and resolving disputes within their domain. These domains varied in size and complexity. Some warriors oversaw small villages, while others governed sprawling estates or border territories. In either case, leadership demanded careful attention to resources, justice, and social harmony. Poor governance could result in rebellion, famine, or the loss of favor from superiors. Warriors employed a range of officials and aides to assist with administration. Scribes recorded transactions and legal decisions. Messengers maintained communication with distant lords, and enforcers carried out judicial rulings. Although the warrior himself might not handle every detail personally, he bore ultimate responsibility for his domain's stability and success. Law enforcement was another key aspect of governance. Warriors maintained peace within their territories by adjudicating civil disputes, punishing theft or disorder, and ensuring that rules were clearly communicated and consistently applied. Justice was often swift and based on communal standards, but warriors were also expected to act with fairness and avoid tyranny. Tax collection formed the economic foundation of a warrior's administration. Taxes were typically gathered in the form of rice, labor, or other goods. Accurate accounting was essential, and corruption or mismanagement could destabilize an entire region. Wise leaders built systems of oversight and personally inspected storehouses to verify honesty among their subordinates. Infrastructure was also under the warriors' purview. Roads, irrigation systems, and bridges were vital for commerce, mobility, and agriculture. Warriors invested in maintaining and improving these structures, understanding that the strength of their territory depended not only on soldiers, but on the prosperity of its inhabitants. In times of crisis, flood, drought, famine, or invasion, warriors coordinated relief efforts. They organized food distribution, rebuilt damaged structures, and negotiated alliances with neighboring territories to secure assistance. Their ability to manage disasters effectively could solidify their reputation and expand their influence. Bureaucratic training began early, often alongside martial education. Young warriors studied land records, legal codes, and economic principles. Older warriors, especially those nearing retirement from the battlefield, often transitioned into full-time administrative roles, using their experience and authority to maintain order and prosperity. Ceremonial duties also formed part of governance. Warriors hosted seasonal events, military parades, and public feasts, which reinforced loyalty among the people and demonstrated the benevolence of leadership. These occasions blended cultural tradition with political utility, building unity. Through shared identity, communication with superiors and allies required diplomacy. Warriors composed formal reports, received directives, and participated in councils. Clear, respectful communication was vital to maintaining favor and navigating the complex web of feudal politics. Governance, therefore, was an extension of the warrior code. The same values, honor, loyalty, discipline, and compassion, that shaped behavior in combat also guided the management of people and resources. A warrior who ruled wisely could transform a chaotic region into a thriving domain. By integrating battlefield skill with political leadership, warriors became indispensable to the functioning of feudal society. Their legacy was not only written in victories, but in the laws enforced, harvests protected, and communities nurtured under their watchful eye. Chapter 11. War Campaigns, Tactics, and Battlefield Life. The warrior's legacy is perhaps most vividly remembered on the battlefield, where tactics, courage, and discipline were put to the ultimate test. Wars were a recurring reality in the feudal era, with conflicts ranging from small-scale territorial disputes to large, strategic campaigns aimed at controlling regions or central authority. The art of warfare was as much about strategic planning and supply management as it was about combat. Warriors participated in campaigns that were often long and grueling. These campaigns required not only individual prowess, but also cooperation, communication, and strategic foresight. Preparation began well before the first arrow was loosed or the first sword drawn. Scouts were sent ahead, maps were consulted, and weather conditions assessed. Leaders would gather their captains to devise a plan, taking terrain, enemy strength, and timing into consideration. Supply lines were vital to a successful campaign. Warriors understood that a hungry army could not fight effectively. Carts of rice, water, medical supplies, and spare equipment traveled behind the main force. Logistic officers ensured that provisions were rationed and that horses and troops were rotated and rested when possible. The best commanders were those who could maintain discipline and morale under the harshest conditions. Marching to the battlefield was itself a ritual of endurance and unity. Troops moved in formation, with banners flying, drums beating, and ranks kept orderly. Morale was a critical factor. Songs, chants, and speeches by commanders helped remind warriors of the stakes and reinforce their loyalty to the cause. On the battlefield, tactics varied depending on terrain and the number of forces involved. Open field battles often featured a combination of archers, spearmen, cavalry, and foot soldiers. Armored warriors led charges while light infantry maneuvered around flanks. The use of terrain, whether forests, hills, rivers, or plains, often determined which side gained the advantage. Communication during battle was managed through signals, flags, drums, and messengers. Commanders needed to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, sometimes shifting formations or calling retreats in the face of surprise attacks. Those who excelled in the chaos of battle earned great respect, often rising in rank based on performance rather than family ties alone. Siege warfare was another common aspect of campaign life. Castles and fortresses served as both defensive and administrative centers. When laying siege, warriors would encircle the target, cut off supplies, and attempt to breach walls using siege towers, fire, and tunnels. Defenders, on the other hand, used boiling oil, stones, and arrows to repel attackers. These sieges could last weeks or even months, testing both the attacker's resolve and the defender's resilience. Living conditions during campaigns were harsh. Warriors slept in tents or makeshift shelters, often exposed to the elements. Illness, injury, and exhaustion were constant threats. Yet these hardships were endured with stoicism, as endurance and toughness were seen as marks of true warriors. Bonds formed during such trials were strong and often lasted a lifetime. After battles, rituals of remembrance and honor were held. Fallen comrades were mourned, and their deeds recounted around campfires or memorial services. Victories were celebrated with discipline, never with arrogance. Leaders often reminded their men that every success was shared and every loss a lesson. Sometimes, diplomacy followed war. Victorious commanders would negotiate terms with defeated foes, offering clemency in exchange for allegiance or tribute. These arrangements helped reduce bloodshed and allowed for a more stable transfer of power. A wise warrior recognized that victory did not end with the clash of arms. It continued in the decisions made afterward. In every campaign, the ideals of the warrior code were tested. The battlefield revealed a warrior's true character, whether he could remain composed under pressure, act with honor in the face of chaos, and lead with both courage and compassion. War, though brutal, was also seen as a proving ground for the soul. The scars borne home were not only physical, but moral, each one a story etched into the legacy of those who served. Chapter 12. The role of women in warrior society. While the warrior class was often dominated by men, the role of women within this world was both significant and multifaceted. Though less frequently recorded in formal chronicles, women were indispensable to the structure, stability, and continuity of warrior households. Their influence spanned education, estate management, diplomacy, religious life, and even martial defense when circumstances demanded it. From a young age, daughters in warrior families were taught not only domestic skills, but also moral discipline, literacy, and cultural refinement. These early teachings prepared them to become the moral and organizational centers of their households. In many cases, women were the primary educators of children, instilling in sons and daughters the values of loyalty, duty, and honor from the very beginning. Some mothers guided their children's early martial training, especially in smaller households where professional tutors were not always available. Marriage among the warrior class was rarely a matter of personal choice. Instead, it was a strategic arrangement between families, often aimed at consolidating alliances, securing land, or strengthening political ties. Women entered these unions prepared to assume complex roles, serving not only as wives, but as mediators, advisors, and stewards of household affairs. They were expected to uphold the dignity of their birth families while also promoting the prosperity of their husband's line. Within the household, women managed finances, oversaw servants and laborers, supervised agricultural and logistical operations, and ensured proper conduct among all members of the domestic sphere. Their competence ensured that the estate functioned smoothly during times of peace and war alike. When men were away on campaign, it was the women who preserved stability, protected family assets, and made crucial decisions in their absence. Their leadership under such pressure often earned them quiet reverence within their communities. Some women were trained in the use of weapons, particularly in households that feared invasion or siege. These women, though fewer in number, practiced with daggers, short swords, or polearms and were expected to defend their homes if necessary. Stories exist of women leading defensive efforts during attacks, rallying retainers, and standing their ground with remarkable resolve. In a few exceptional cases, women commanded defensive campaigns or became folk heroes within their local regions. Widows often assumed full control of estates and were recognized as legitimate authority figures. In the absence of a male heir, or if the heir was too young, mothers or aunts stepped in as regents, overseeing all affairs until the rightful leader could take charge. These women negotiated with rivals, collected taxes, and enforced laws, often displaying exceptional political acumen. Their ability to maintain order during uncertain times was a crucial factor in preserving dynastic continuity. Culturally, women contributed through the arts and religious observance. They maintained family shrines, organized ceremonies, and ensured that seasonal and ancestral rituals were upheld. Many were accomplished in poetry, calligraphy, and music, skills which enhanced the household's prestige and reflected its refinement. Some even engaged in diplomacy, carrying messages between factions, fostering peace negotiations, or advising husbands and sons in times of political upheaval. These diplomatic roles were often understated but highly strategic. Women also played essential roles in legacy and remembrance. They chronicled family history, preserved heirlooms, and made sure the names and deeds of their ancestors were honored. Their work as stewards of memory helped maintain continuity and identity across generations. They curated family archives, commissioned genealogies, and ensured that the lineages of the warrior class were never forgotten. Despite their influence, women faced significant limitations in terms of social mobility and formal recognition. Legal rights were often restricted, and public roles remained largely informal. Opportunities for independent advancement were rare, and most women functioned within the framework of family duties. Nevertheless, their presence was undeniable. Behind nearly every great warrior stood a network of women whose labor, wisdom, and resilience made his achievements possible. In rare but significant instances, women chose to remain unmarried and instead pursued spiritual or scholarly paths. Some joined religious communities, where they became respected for their learning or piety. Others took on educational roles, teaching younger generations of noble children in matters of etiquette, morality, or cultural knowledge. These women carved out small yet impactful spheres of autonomy and intellectual influence. The role of women in warrior society was thus complex and foundational. They were not merely supporters, they were pillars of a world built on loyalty, tradition, and strength. Through quiet determination and adaptive intelligence, they helped shape a society often credited only to its men. Their contributions, while sometimes hidden in history, remain deeply woven into the fabric of the warrior legacy. To understand the warrior fully, one must also understand the vital and dynamic role of the women who shaped, supported, and strengthened him from within the walls of both home and society. Chapter 13: Education, Mentorship, and the Transmission of Knowledge. The continuation of warrior culture relied not only on swordsmanship and discipline, but on the careful transmission of values, techniques, and wisdom from one generation to the next. This passing of knowledge was a deeply personal, often sacred, process that shaped every young warrior from childhood to adulthood. At the center of this process were the intertwined roles of formal education, private mentorship, and inherited tradition. Education began in the home, usually under the supervision of parents and household tutors. Young warriors were taught to read, write, and calculate, but their lessons also included poetry, philosophy, etiquette, and military history. Instruction took place in dedicated study halls or rooms within family estates, where children learned by copying classical texts, listening to recitations, and observing their elders. Memorization was emphasized to train the mind, and writing was treated as both an intellectual and moral exercise. The earliest instruction focused on the cultivation of character. Children were expected to demonstrate self-control, honesty, humility, and respect toward elders. Misbehavior or failure to meet these standards was met with correction, not punishment alone, but constructive guidance meant to instill discipline. These formative experiences were seen as the first steps toward the internalization of the warrior code. Mentorship was perhaps the most vital aspect of a warrior's growth. Older warriors, often uncles, senior retainers, or respected instructors, took younger warriors under their wing. This relationship, built on trust and loyalty, often endured for life. Mentors guided their students not only in martial techniques, but also in decision-making, leadership, and ethical conduct. In turn, younger warriors were expected to obey, serve, and eventually honor their mentors by embodying their lessons. Martial skills were taught through physical repetition and live demonstration. Students learned how to use various weapons, how to move in armor, how to strike, defend, and counterattack. These lessons often began with wooden training weapons and progressed to blunted steel under controlled conditions. Mistakes were seen as opportunities for growth, and students were taught to accept critique with gratitude rather than pride. Sparring was not merely physical. It was a test of focus, perception, and internal strength. Warriors learned to anticipate an opponent's intention, read subtle movements, and respond with clarity. Training fields became arenas for intellectual combat as well as physical trial, and students emerged not only stronger but more self-aware. The teaching of strategy was equally important. Students studied maps, reviewed battle accounts, and participated in war games that mimicked real-life scenarios. These exercises encouraged foresight, creativity, and understanding of larger political or geographical contexts. A good warrior was expected to lead, not simply fight. Aside from mentors, warriors often learned from one another. Peer-to-peer education was common, and camaraderie built during shared exercises often developed into lifelong bonds. These relationships, rooted in shared struggle and mutual respect, created a network of future allies and advisors. Beyond the battlefield, the transmission of cultural knowledge was key. Warriors were taught to appreciate poetry, music, and visual art, not as luxuries, but as disciplines that refine the mind. Writing a poem about a fallen comrade, composing a melody for a festival, or sketching a battlefield diagram were all expressions of depth and understanding. These cultural skills distinguished the warrior-scholar ideal. The transmission of knowledge also included cautionary tales. Warriors were taught about past betrayals, failed campaigns, or dishonorable deaths, not to provoke fear, but to instill vigilance and humility. Instructors frequently used historical anecdotes to illustrate the consequences of arrogance, disloyalty, or poor judgment. Ceremonies marked key milestones in a student's progression. Coming-of-age rituals, oath-swearing, or acceptance into a retainer household were often formalized with symbolic clothing, gifts of training weapons, or public acknowledgement. These rituals reinforced the gravity of the warrior's path and connected personal progress to ancestral legacy. Importantly, education never ended. Even seasoned warriors continued to seek instruction, exchange knowledge, and refine their understanding of martial, ethical, and administrative subjects. To grow complacent was to dishonor one's mentors and endanger those who depended on them. Through mentorship and education, the essence of the warrior class endured generation after generation. This system did not simply produce soldiers. It created individuals capable of leadership, reflection, and resilience. By prioritizing wisdom alongside strength, the warrior tradition became not just a way of life, but a continuous legacy shaped by every teacher, every student, and every lesson, passed from hand to hand and heart to heart. Chapter 14: Art, Aesthetics, and the Warrior's Cultivation of Beauty. Despite the harsh demands of battle and duty, warriors found deep meaning in the pursuit and appreciation of beauty. The development of artistic skill and aesthetic sensitivity was not considered an indulgence, but rather a vital part of personal refinement and spiritual balance. The warrior class cultivated an appreciation for visual art, poetry, architecture, calligraphy, and even the nuanced arrangement of objects in a room, believing that these disciplines strengthened character and deepened wisdom to the heart of. This artistic practice was the belief that beauty and discipline were inherently connected. Just as a sword must be wielded with grace and control, so too must ink be guided with precision across a scroll. Warriors trained their hands to deliver death or write verse with equal steadiness, believing both acts required clarity of thought and presence of mind. Poetry, especially, was held in high esteem. Warriors composed poems to commemorate victories, mourn losses, honor nature, and express reflections on duty and mortality. These poems were shared among peers, inscribed in letters, or recited during formal gatherings. The creation of poetry was often taught alongside martial studies, helping to instill restraint, perspective, and emotional awareness. A short verse could capture the heart of a moment more powerfully than a long speech. Calligraphy was another cornerstone of cultural education. More than penmanship, it was a disciplined art form that demanded focused movement, breath control, and emotional balance. Each stroke of the brush was judged not only on form, but on its energy and intention. Warriors trained to write with elegance and flow, viewing the page as a space for both structure and spontaneity. The warrior's environment was also shaped by aesthetic values. Residences and meeting halls were designed with an emphasis on simplicity, harmony, and natural materials. Rooms were carefully arranged to convey a sense of peace, focus, and dignity. Objects were placed with intention. Scrolls and flowers displayed in alcoves reflected seasonal changes and personal sentiment. These spaces were not merely functional. They were silent extensions of the warrior's mind. The tea ceremony, often led or participated in by warriors, was one of the most refined expressions of discipline through aesthetics. It combined movement, hospitality, architecture, and seasonal awareness into a singular experience. Preparing and serving tea became a spiritual exercise, reinforcing ideals of humility, attentiveness, and quiet respect. For warriors, the tea room offered a sacred pause from the violence of war, a space where even the highest-ranking leaders practiced equality and reflection. Music, too, found its place in the warrior's world. While few were trained to perform publicly, many warriors learned to play instruments or at least appreciate their resonance. The sound of a flute or lute at twilight was believed to evoke introspection and serenity. Such moments softened the spirit, allowing warriors to reconnect with their humanity in contrast to the brutality they often witnessed. Painting and ink drawing were additional methods through which warriors captured landscapes, battles, animals, or moments of solitude. These artworks were not always elaborate. Even simple sketches carried meaning. Warriors often portrayed mountains, rivers, or birds, symbols of endurance, passage, and vigilance. Their artistic expressions, like their martial techniques, reflected internal states as much as external skill. Aesthetic cultivation also played a social and diplomatic role. Gifts of art or poetry between warriors and noble families carried emotional weight and political intent. A finely written poem could open the door to an alliance, while a beautifully painted scroll might secure goodwill or commemorate a shared victory. Cultural literacy was thus not only personal, it was strategic. Philosophically, beauty reminded warriors of the fleeting nature of life. Cherry blossoms, fading quickly after blooming, were seen as metaphors for the warrior's own impermanence. To appreciate something beautiful was to acknowledge the fragility of existence and thus embrace it more fully. This awareness helped many warriors accept mortality not with despair, but with gratitude. Through the cultivation of art and aesthetics, warriors became more than fighters. They became creators, patrons, and philosophers. Their legacy was preserved, not only in the history of battlefields, but in the poems they penned, the scrolls they brushed, and the spaces they shaped. These expressions of beauty, subtle and profound, enrich their lives and continue to illuminate the depth of their tradition. Chapter 15: Festivals, Public Life, and Warrior Engagement with Society. Warriors, though often associated with the private world of estates, castles, and training grounds, were also deeply engaged in the broader life of their communities. Their presence extended beyond the battlefield and court, finding meaningful expression in public rituals, festivals, and service. Through these engagements, they reinforced social hierarchies, fostered loyalty among the populace, and reaffirmed their identity as protectors and cultural leaders. Seasonal festivals were among the most important public events in which warriors participated. These occasions marked transitions in the agricultural calendar, religious observances, and the remembrance of historical events. Warriors sponsored and often presided over these festivals, funding dances, parades, and rituals that blended religious devotion with civic pride. Their participation emphasized continuity, stability, and their connection to the land and its people. During festivals, warriors would wear formal attire and often process through the streets accompanied by banners, music, and retainers. These parades were not merely for display. They were carefully choreographed demonstrations of order and dignity. The public observed not only the pageantry, but the discipline and unity of the warrior class. Young warriors viewed these processions as opportunities to represent their families and to prove their readiness to assume public roles. Warriors also played key roles in local governance and conflict resolution. In times of peace, they served as magistrates, mediators, and patrons of civic institutions such as schools or temples. Their authority extended to land disputes, tax collection, and the arbitration of trade agreements. They were expected to act not just as enforcers of law, but as exemplars of fairness and honor. Their conduct in such roles was closely observed, as it reflected directly on their family's reputation. Public ceremonies were opportunities for warriors to perform rituals that reinforced their leadership status. Oaths of allegiance, military reviews, and temple dedications allowed the public to witness the moral and spiritual responsibilities that came with warrior authority. These events served to bond the warrior class with their vassals and communities. Through shared spectacle and solemn ritual, education and mentorship often extended into the public sphere. Warriors established or supported schools for the children of retainers and lower-ranking families. They provided instruction in ethics, writing, and even martial skills, believing that a well-educated populace contributed to a stable and honorable society. Sponsorship of scholars and artists helped foster cultural flourishing and intellectual development that in times of disaster, such as floods, fires, or famines, warriors were expected to take swift and decisive action. They organized relief efforts, distributed food, and coordinated rebuilding projects. In these moments, their authority became humanitarian, demonstrating their commitment to the protection of all within their domains. Such acts of compassion reinforced their image not only as fighters, but as stewards of communal well-being. The warriors' relationship with common people was complex but essential. While strict social hierarchies remained in place, mutual respect could flourish. Farmers, artisans, and merchants understood that their prosperity was linked to the stability provided by their warrior lords. In turn, wise warriors listened to the concerns of the populace, mindful that the strength of a community depended on the trust between its rulers and the ruled. Markets and fairs held during festivals also served as informal venues for social observation. Warriors walked among the stalls, purchased goods, and exchanged greetings. These acts, though casual, were part of the subtle negotiation of class and community roles. A warrior's presence could encourage commerce, attract craftsmen, and ensure a peaceful atmosphere. Through these public engagements, warriors demonstrated that their power was not only physical but social and moral. Their visibility in civic life helped define the values of their society: discipline, generosity, courage, and loyalty. Their role was both symbolic and functional, serving as the bridge between the elite and the common, the sacred and the secular in the festivals they led. The justice they upheld and the care they provided in times of crisis, warriors reinforced their legitimacy and legacy. These communal ties were not incidental. They were integral to the endurance of the warrior class. By embracing public life, warriors ensured that their influence extended beyond war and into the living, breathing heart of the society they swore to protect. Chapter 16: Decline, Transformation, and Legacy of the Warrior Class. With all-powerful institutions, the era of the traditional warrior did not last forever. While their influence endured for centuries, the social, political, and technological changes of the early modern period gradually transformed and ultimately diminished the role of the warrior class. Yet even as their political power waned, their cultural legacy remained deeply woven into the fabric of the nation. The seeds of decline were sown not through a single defeat or moment of failure, but through a slow evolution of state power and administrative centralization. As the country moved toward unification under a single military government, the independence once enjoyed by regional warriors began to erode. Central authorities restructured governance, reducing the autonomy of local warlords and drawing power inward to the capital point. One of the most profound changes came with the end of constant warfare. After centuries of near-continuous conflict, a long period of relative peace reshaped the warrior's function. No longer needed to lead armies or defend borders, many warriors were reassigned to administrative roles. Some flourished in this new setting, becoming bureaucrats, educators, or advisors. Others struggled to adapt, clinging to an identity rooted in battle while the world changed around them. The introduction and advancement of gunpowder weaponry also played a critical role. Firearms, cannons, and new siege technologies rendered traditional sword-based combat less central to military strategy. Though warriors did adopt these new tools, the spiritual and aesthetic emphasis placed on close combat began to fade. The battlefield became a place of noise and numbers, reducing the individual heroism that had once defined warrior culture. Economic shifts further undermined the warrior class. Many families faced financial hardship as stipends were reduced or eliminated. The cost of maintaining a household, coupled with diminishing influence, forced some warriors into trade or farming, occupations once deemed beneath their status. Others became scholars or wandered in search of purpose, caught between a noble past and uncertain future. Despite these challenges, the cultural legacy of the warrior class deepened. Literature, theater, and art portrayed them as paragons of virtue, guardians of justice, and tragic figures caught in the tides of history. The values they championed, loyalty, discipline, sacrifice, remained central to the national identity. Schools taught their history, and their stories continued to be passed down as moral instruction. Some warrior families successfully reinvented themselves. They embraced education, governance, and diplomacy, becoming key figures in the new order. Their adaptability allowed them to retain social prestige even as their military role diminished. Others preserved their traditions through martial arts schools, poetry circles, or historical societies, ensuring that the essence of their values survived. The transformation of the warrior class was not a collapse, but a transition. What had once been a ruling elite of sword and armor evolved into a legacy of philosophy, ethics, and service. Their physical presence in politics may have faded, but their influence endured in subtler, more enduring forms. Even in modern times, the imagery and ideals of the warrior remain powerful. Their armor is displayed in museums, their writings studied in schools, their code invoked in leadership seminars and popular media. While the world that created them has vanished, the resonance of their example continues to inspire. In the end, the warrior class was both a product and a shaper of history. Its members fought wars, wrote laws, built institutions, and defined the character of a nation. Though their swords may rest in silence, their spirit remains, a timeless echo of honor, duty, and the enduring human pursuit of meaning through discipline and sacrifice. Chapter 17. The warrior in popular imagination and national identity. Even after their practical role diminished, the warrior remained a central figure in the cultural and psychological imagination of the nation. Their image, steeped in courage, discipline, and loyalty, was immortalized in stories, performances, and symbols that shaped national consciousness. As the country entered a new era of modernization, industrial growth, and global engagement, the warrior was reinvented as a symbol of continuity and moral virtue. Literature was among the first mediums to mythologize the warrior's legacy. Historical epics, fictional tales, and personal memoirs highlighted their bravery, romanticized their struggles, and codified their values into narrative form. These works were often written with the purpose of national education, instilling in readers a sense of pride and identity rooted in the past. Heroes from centuries before were revived in books and plays, their names invoked as exemplars of how one ought to live and serve. Theater, particularly traditional forms like stylized dance drama, presented warrior tales on stage with exaggerated elegance. The movements, costumes, and themes emphasized emotion, duty, and sacrifice. Audiences came not only to be entertained, but to witness reenactments of timeless virtues. Through these performances, the warrior's voice remained alive, speaking across generations about the meaning of courage and honor. Visual arts also celebrated the warrior ideal. Paintings, woodblock prints, and sculptures depicted legendary battles, duels, and heroic deaths. These images were not always historically accurate, but they were rich in symbolic meaning. They illustrated the values of strength, resolve, and commitment to one's cause, often against impossible odds. Artists stylized warriors not as real individuals, but as avatars of higher principles. In education, the warrior was framed as a moral model. Schools taught about famous figures, using their lives as lessons in perseverance, ethical behavior, and civic responsibility. Children were encouraged to emulate their self-control and sense of duty. Teachers emphasized that the greatness of the nation was forged not only through innovation and industry, but also through adherence to timeless values, embodied in the warrior spirit. During times of national crisis or uncertainty, the image of the warrior was frequently invoked. Political Leaders and cultural commentators reference their bravery and unity, appealing to shared heritage as a source of strength. Propaganda and patriotic art sometimes utilized warrior imagery to galvanize the public, encouraging citizens to adopt the same steadfastness and sacrifice in the face of adversity that in modern media. The warrior continued to evolve. Novels, films, and television dramas reinterpreted their stories for contemporary audiences. Some explored historical realism, while others leaned into fantasy or philosophical reflection. Despite stylistic differences, the core attributes remained intact: discipline, loyalty, resilience. New generations discovered the warrior mythos through these narratives, often finding relevance in the timeless struggle between personal desire and duty. Tourism and heritage industries also preserved and promoted warrior culture. Castles were restored, reenactments performed, and historical trails marked to attract visitors. Museums displayed armor, weapons, and documents that allowed people to physically connect with the past. These sites became places of learning and reflection, reminding both locals and travelers of the enduring impact of the warrior tradition. Academics contributed to the discussion by analyzing the warrior's evolution in literature, psychology, and sociology. They explored how the warrior identity influenced leadership models, interpersonal ethics, and the concept of service. In this way, the legacy was not just preserved but actively examined, reshaped, and reinterpreted in light of changing cultural and political landscapes. The warrior thus remains more than a historical figure. He is a cultural touchstone, a vessel, for the ideals that continue to shape identity, behavior, and vision. Whether seen in a textbook, a mural, or a modern retelling, his presence challenges individuals to live with greater purpose, restraint, and resolve. In this way, the warrior is not confined to the past. He walks beside the present, whispering reminders of what endures when strength is tempered by wisdom, and when honor is not a performance but a way of life. Chapter 18: The Warrior's Code in Modern Leadership and Ethics. Though centuries have passed since the warrior's sword was raised in battle, the ethical and philosophical foundations of their way of life continue to resonate. The Warrior Code, once a set of guiding principles for conduct in war and governance, has evolved into a framework used by modern leaders, educators, and thinkers across many professions. Its enduring relevance lies in its core values: discipline, loyalty, integrity, courage, and service, which continue to offer guidance in a world still fraught with complexity and moral challenge. In contemporary leadership, the principles of the Warrior's Code are often cited as ideals for effective governance and organizational management. Leaders who embody humility, accountability, and clarity of purpose are respected, much like warriors of the past were honored for their restraint, foresight, and self-sacrifice. Modern training programs in business, government, and the military frequently draw inspiration from these historical teachings to instill resilience, strategic thinking, and ethical behavior. Self-discipline remains central to the code's modern interpretation. In both personal development and professional life, the practice of refining the mind and body to overcome weakness and temptation is viewed as a path to mastery. Modern leaders who wake early, maintain rigorous routines, and reflect regularly on their decisions are drawing directly from the warrior's ethos. Their consistency becomes a form of leadership in itself. Loyalty, once a principle aimed at lords and liege, now reflects commitment to team, mission, or purpose. In workplaces, loyalty is expressed through trust, reliability, and unity in facing challenges. This form of ethical allegiance strengthens bonds within communities and organizations, fostering collaboration and long-term success. Yet, just as warriors were taught to balance loyalty with justice, modern interpretations stress that allegiance must never override moral judgment. The courage promoted by the Warrior Code extends beyond the battlefield. Today, it includes moral courage, the willingness to speak the truth, defend the vulnerable, and act ethically in the face of peer pressure or institutional inertia. Whether it be a manager challenging unfair policies or an activist standing for justice, courage grounded in conviction mirrors the warrior's resolve in the face of danger. Service is another enduring pillar. Warriors were trained to live not for themselves, but for those they protected. That sense of duty, of placing others before personal gain, continues to inspire public servants, healthcare workers, educators, and volunteers. Service is a grounding force, a reminder that leadership is not about power, but about responsibility. Even in education, the warrior's teachings find a place. Schools and youth programs often integrate lessons on character building and civic responsibility inspired by these ideals. The stories of historical warriors, with their emphasis on perseverance, self-control, and honor, serve as tools to shape thoughtful, principled individuals. The symbolic elements of the warrior also persist. Uniforms, ceremonies, and rituals across cultures incorporate martial precision and solemnity, often invoking themes of sacrifice and unity. The reverence given to flags, memorials, and codes of conduct reflects the lasting influence of a worldview where actions carried weight and words were bound by duty. Ethics in the modern world remain deeply indebted to the warrior's emphasis on principle. From codes of conduct in professional associations to the unwritten expectations within families and communities, echoes of the warrior code remind us that integrity is not optional, it is foundational. It calls individuals to live honorably, to be reliable in crisis, and to place meaning above convenience. The warrior may no longer ride into battle in armor, but his legacy endures wherever people strive to lead with courage, act with integrity, and serve with humility. His presence is felt in the quiet determination of a teacher, the firm but fair judgment of a manager, and the moral clarity of a community leader. Thus, the warrior's code, once forged in fire and sharpened on the anvil of survival, now endures as a living philosophy, an ethical compass for those who seek to lead not with domination, but with wisdom, honor, and enduring purpose. Chapter 19. Training, Discipline, and Martial Arts in the Modern World. Although traditional warfare has faded into history, the essence of warrior training endures through martial arts. Across the globe, dojos, training halls, and martial academies continue to pass down centuries-old techniques rooted in the ethos of the warrior class. These disciplines not only preserve ancient forms of combat, but also serve as vehicles for mental discipline, personal growth, and cultural continuity. Martial arts, once the core of battlefield readiness, have been refined and formalized into diverse systems. Some remain focused on practical self-defense and physical conditioning, while others emphasize the internal journey, balancing mind, body, and spirit. From rigid stances and precise strikes to breathing techniques and meditative movements, the core principle is always the same: mastery of self. Training in martial arts begins with repetition. Students are taught to bow, stand, and move with respect and awareness. Techniques are practiced tirelessly, from the simplest footwork to complex forms or drills. This ritualistic repetition mirrors the training of ancient warriors who knew that discipline and practice led to effectiveness in combat. The value of patience, humility, and endurance is ingrained into each session. Instructors, often called sensei or masters in various traditions, hold an honored place in the lives of students. Their authority is not based solely on skill, but on character, wisdom, and the ability to guide others through both physical technique and moral lessons. They echo the mentors of old, shaping not only how a student fights, but how they live. Contemporary martial arts schools often maintain hierarchical structures similar to traditional warrior clans. Ranks, belts, or titles symbolize progress and responsibility. Advanced students are expected to mentor beginners, creating a culture of mutual respect and shared growth. These traditions ensure that each generation contributes to the preservation and evolution of the art. The mental component of martial arts is equally vital. Practitioners are taught to remain calm under pressure, to assess threats rationally, and to act without hesitation when necessary. Meditation, visualization, and controlled breathing are tools used to sharpen focus and regulate emotion. These practices reflect the ancient warriors' need to stay composed amidst chaos. Martial arts are also deeply intertwined with philosophy. Lessons on balance, non-aggression, and moral responsibility often accompany physical instruction. Students are taught that true strength lies not in domination but in self-restraint, and that every conflict should be approached with clarity and purpose. Such teachings align closely with the warrior's historical view that the blade is best sheathed when possible. In modern society, martial arts serve multiple roles. For some, it is a means of self-defense. For others, a path to fitness, confidence, or mental health. In law enforcement and military training, modified martial systems continue to instill discipline and tactical skill. In civilian life, martial arts foster focus, humility, and resilience. Competitions and exhibitions also provide opportunities for practitioners to test their skills in structured environments. While not equivalent to battle, these events uphold traditions of honor, courage, and respect for opponents. Victory is not solely determined by winning, but by the dignity with which one competes. In educational settings, martial arts have become tools for youth development. Programs in schools or community centers offer children lessons in responsibility, cooperation, and goal setting. They offer a physical outlet while reinforcing principles of kindness, patience, and respect. Globally, martial arts continue to evolve. New styles emerge, blending traditional techniques with contemporary needs. Yet the heart of the practice, the pursuit of excellence through discipline and inner growth, remains unchanged. Whether practiced on a polished wooden floor or in a modern studio, martial arts carry forward the soul of the warrior tradition. In this way, the legacy of the warrior endures not only in stories and symbols, but in movement, breath, and purpose. Every strike, stance, and bow echoes with the wisdom of the past and the promise of future mastery. Through martial arts, the warrior lives on, quietly, powerfully, and with unwavering resolve. Chapter 20. The Eternal Warrior, a Legacy Beyond Time. The warrior may have once been a figure of steel and silence, of armor glinting beneath banners flapping in the wind, but his legacy has long since transcended battlefield and banner. He now stands as a symbol, etched into the fabric of time, not only as a relic of violence or duty, but as an enduring guidepost for the human spirit. In this final chapter, we explore the broad and enduring reach of the warrior archetype as it continues to shape thought, discipline, and identity across borders, generations, and ideologies. The warrior's transformation from active protector to archetypal ideal is not a retreat into nostalgia, but a persistent presence in global consciousness. His image appears in films, literature, philosophy, video games, motivational speeches, personal development courses, and even spiritual disciplines. In each manifestation, the figure may change, helmet or hood, sword or pen, but the core remains: resolve, restraint, and responsibility. Modern culture has reimagined the warrior not only as a soldier, but as a parent, teacher, athlete, or entrepreneur. Wherever a person commits themselves to a path of service, masters their impulses, or chooses the difficult right over the easy wrong, the echo of the warrior's code resounds. The lessons once confined to battlefield and temple now guide people through careers, relationships, and crises of meaning. In a world flooded with distraction and immediacy, the enduring presence of the warrior offers something radical: depth. The warrior's way reminds us to be intentional, to breathe, to focus, to act with clarity even when overwhelmed. In that sense, the warrior becomes more than a figure of historical interest. He becomes a guardian of values often neglected. In modern life, across the globe, modern individuals seek warrior discipline in diverse practices: martial arts, mindfulness, fitness regimes, ethical business leadership, and philosophical study. The modern warrior may never see combat, but they battle inner demons, social injustice, or physical limitation. The battlefield has shifted, but the war remains real and noble. What defines the eternal warrior is not the weapon in his hand, but the clarity of his intention. His victory is not in the conquest of others, but in the mastery of self. He is guided not by hatred, but by duty, not by arrogance, but by principle. The power of the warrior lies not in domination, but in the restraint that power allows him to choose. It is this restraint that perhaps most defines the warrior's maturity. Children clamor for power. The undisciplined seek control. But the warrior, who knows the burden of command and the weight of violence, seeks peace. and defends it only when peace itself is under threat. His sword is a last resort, and his silence often speaks louder than force. In the digital age, where conflict is often waged through words and reputations can be wounded in seconds, the internal code of the warrior is more vital than ever. Civility, perspective, and patience become the armor. Thoughtfulness becomes the blade. The eternal warrior understands that not all battles require swords, and not all victories leave scars. The warrior also teaches us how to lose. Not in shame, but in dignity. To bow when bested. To accept limits without defeat. To see struggle not as punishment, but as purification. In this way, he becomes a teacher of resilience. Not the shallow version that simply insists on endurance, but a profound form of survival rooted in meaning, self-awareness, and transformation. As the world faces technological acceleration, cultural fragmentation, and environmental strain, the timeless ideals of the warrior can offer balance. His code demands unity of thought, speech, and action. He resists distraction. He questions comfort. He walks forward, slowly but unshakably, toward a goal not always seen, but always felt. There is no final battle for the warrior, no last arena in which he wins or loses for all time. His fight is eternal because the fight is within. As long as there is fear, injustice, confusion, and weakness in the world or the heart, there will be warriors rising quietly to meet them. Let the armor be metaphorical, the battlefield internal, the legacy shared. The warrior lives on. In those who endure with honor, speak with integrity, move with purpose, and serve without recognition. He lives in every person who looks into the storm and says, "I will not falter." And so we close, not with an end, but with a beginning. For the warrior's path is not a story concluded, but a flame carried. It belongs now to those who would take up its quiet fire and walk with it, not in the shadow of the past, but in the light it continues to cast across the present and into the unknown horizon of what lies ahead. Chapter 21. The Warrior and the Environment. Stewardship of the land. While the warrior is often remembered for his discipline and combat, his relationship to the land was equally profound. Warriors were not only defenders of territory, but also custodians of forests, rivers, and fields. Their understanding of nature shaped strategies, supplied resources, and anchored their identity to the very soil they swore to protect. This respect for the natural world was more than tactical. It was spiritual. Historically, warriors relied heavily on their surrounding environment not just for food and shelter, but for their entire way of life. They studied seasonal changes, knew the migration patterns of local animals, and understood how geography influenced military movement. A mountain was not just an obstacle. It was a shield, a lookout, or a trap. A river could be a barrier or a lifeline, depending on how one read its flow. Warriors had to be expert observers of their surroundings, developing a symbiotic relationship with the land they inhabited. In times of peace, warriors oversaw the management of farmlands and forests. They often assumed responsibility for regulating irrigation systems, ensuring that communities had clean water and fertile soil. Deforestation was monitored carefully, as uncontrolled felling of trees could destabilize hillsides and cause landslides, especially in mountainous regions. Warriors worked alongside farmers and builders, understanding that maintaining a healthy environment was essential for sustaining both life and livelihood. Sacred groves, ancient trees, and untouched waterfalls were often treated with reverence. The warrior's spirituality was deeply tied to natural landmarks, many of which were seen as the dwelling places of spirits or ancestors. Rituals were conducted at these sites before battles, during harvest seasons, or to mark the changing of the year. Offerings might include food, symbolic weapons, or written prayers, expressing gratitude and asking for protection. Natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, and famines were not seen merely as acts of chance, but as tests or warnings. Warriors took it upon themselves to respond swiftly to such crises, rebuilding dikes, rerouting streams, or rationing food. These actions not only saved lives, but reinforced their legitimacy as stewards of both land and people. They believed that a warrior's strength should be used not only to defeat enemies, but also to protect the vulnerable forces of nature that gave life to all. Some warrior schools incorporated environmental awareness into their training. Students were taught to read clouds, track animals, identify edible plants, and navigate by stars or moss-covered trees. These skills were not secondary. They were as essential as swordsmanship or archery. The wilderness became both a classroom and a proving ground. Furthermore, the seasons shaped the rhythms of warrior life. Spring was for planting and training. Summer brought travel and scouting. Autumn was the season of harvest and preparation. Winter called for fortification and inward reflection. This cyclical understanding fostered patience and long-term thinking, qualities that mirrored the strategic patience needed in both politics and battle. Hunting was also a common practice among warriors, not only for sustenance, but as a training tool. The quiet stalk, the attentive pause, the coordinated strike, all mirrored combat. Yet ethical hunting practices were observed, and overhunting was discouraged. Every animal killed was acknowledged with a ritual or sign of respect. The idea was to take only what was necessary and always to give thanks. The construction of fortresses and watchtowers also reflected environmental consciousness. Builders used local stone and wood, shaped structures to blend into hillsides, and created moats or walls that doubled as water management systems. Villages were arranged with natural windbreaks in mind, and ceremonial grounds were often chosen based on their alignment with stars or solstices. The warrior's architectural vision was one of harmony and functionality in literature and art. The natural world played a central role. Poets described mist-covered valleys before battle or blossoms falling like snow on a slain comrade's armor. Paintings captured sacred trees or stormy skies as emotional reflections of inner turmoil. Warriors often wrote their final reflections not about their weapons or victories, but about the sun, the earth, the fleeting scent of pine or plum in the warrior's worldview. The land was not to be conquered but honored. It sustained families, shielded secrets, and offered renewal. Warriors understood that to live in harmony with the earth was to preserve their lineage and legacy. Neglecting the land, on the other hand, meant inviting chaos, weakness, and eventual ruin. Today, this legacy is echoed in modern sustainability movements that draw inspiration from ancient practices. Community leaders and environmentalists often look to historical examples of land stewardship as models for ethical and effective living. The warrior's environmental ethos, rooted in observation, respect, and balance, offers enduring lessons for a world now facing its own battles with climate change and ecological collapse. Thus, the warrior was not merely a figure of discipline and valor. He was also a guardian of the land, a student of the seasons, and a witness to the silent power of the natural world. His strength lay not only in the sword he wielded, but in the soil he walked upon with reverence and responsibility. Warriors were not only defenders of territory, but also custodians of forests, rivers, and fields. Their understanding of nature shaped strategies, supplied resources, and anchored their identity to the very soil they swore to protect. This respect for the natural world was more than tactical, it was spiritual. Chapter 22: Language, Rhetoric, and the Warrior's Voice. Words held immense power in the world of the warrior. Persuasion, command, and diplomacy all relied on a warrior's mastery of language. Whether addressing a council of allies, composing a letter, or offering last words before battle, the warrior's speech had to be precise, meaningful, and unwavering. The pen, as they discovered, could indeed be as mighty as the sword. Long before battle cries filled the air, it was through language that warriors formed alliances, negotiated terms, and inspired followers. Speech was not mere ornamentation, it was a strategic tool. A commander might rally 1,000 men with a single phrase, or dissolve tensions with a well-timed proverb. Silence, too, had its rhetorical place when used with intent. The disciplined use of voice reflected a disciplined mind. From an early age, warriors were trained not only in swordplay, but also in the art of expression. Public speaking, formal greetings, poetic recitation, and written correspondence were considered as integral to leadership as archery or horseback riding. They learned to speak from the diaphragm, control their cadence, and mirror the moods of their audience. Their words had to convey command without arrogance, empathy without weakness. Rhetorical education was often modeled on historic speeches and correspondence from past masters. Aspiring warriors would study the victories and defeats that hinged on words. How did one warrior de-escalate a blood feud with a gesture of humility? How did another incite a town to resistance with a few stinging lines? Language was never abstract. It was contextual, alive, and powerful. Letters were considered sacred instruments of diplomacy and intimacy. Warriors often wrote to their families before going into battle, carefully selecting every phrase, balancing duty and affection. These letters were preserved, read aloud to younger generations, and studied as models of courage and literary grace. Writing was a way of leaving a part of oneself behind, a final statement in the event of death. The warrior's speech often employed metaphor, allegory, and nature imagery. Rather than simply say, "We must fight," a warrior might describe a pine tree standing firm in a winter storm, or a hawk striking with precision at dawn. This poetic framing elevated their intentions and inspired listeners. It also allowed complex ideas, honor, sacrifice, betrayal, to be conveyed in emotionally resonant ways. Ritualized dialogue was common in both formal and informal settings. When meeting for negotiation, warriors would recite lineage, past deeds, and titles, affirming mutual respect before any discussion began. In ceremonial settings, phrases were memorized and repeated verbatim, forming a chain of tradition that linked the speaker with generations past. These rituals of speech were as sacred as prayer or oath. Storytelling also played a critical role. Around fires or in halls, warriors would recount battles, disasters, and lessons learned. The format was often formulaic, a beginning invoking place and time, a middle of conflict and turning point, and an ending with a moral or caution. These oral histories were pedagogical tools as much as entertainment, transmitting tactical knowledge and cultural values. Critically, language was used not only to lead followers but to confront opponents. Diplomatic confrontations demanded mastery of tone and timing. A misstep in wording could provoke war. A well-placed compliment could secure an alliance. Skilled warriors knew how to read a room, adjust their diction, and even use body language to support or subvert their words. The warrior's voice was also present in law. They delivered judgments, explained decrees, and mediated disputes. Clarity and firmness were crucial. Justice had to be seen as impartial, but also human. The ability to speak calmly, respectfully, and logically was essential in resolving tension and reinforcing social order. In spiritual matters, language carried an almost mystical weight. Warriors recited chants for protection, spoke names of ancestors before duels, and used affirmations during meditation. Words were believed to shape reality. A poorly chosen phrase could attract misfortune. A well-spoken vow could summon strength. The warrior's final words, whether on a battlefield, scaffold, or deathbed, were given great importance. These parting phrases were recorded, memorized, and repeated, sometimes becoming famous sayings. They distilled a lifetime of philosophy into a few lasting lines. Such words became mantras, carved into monuments or whispered in moments of doubt. Even today, the legacy of the warrior's language lives on. Politicians, military officers, and thought leaders draw on warrior rhetoric to inspire and instruct. Martial arts schools teach students to speak with clarity and courtesy, just as they teach them to bow or strike. The ethical foundation remains. Words are not weapons of harm, but tools of connection and truth. Thus, the warrior's voice was as disciplined as his blade. It could cut through confusion, shield the weak, and forge unbreakable bonds. Through language, the warrior transcended time, leaving echoes that still teach, inspire, and guide those who dare to speak with purpose. Persuasion, command, and diplomacy all relied on a warrior's mastery of language. Whether addressing a council of allies, composing a letter, or offering last words before battle, the warrior's speech had to be precise, meaningful, and unwavering. The pen, as they discovered, could indeed be as mighty as the sword. Chapter 23. The Warrior Abroad. Influence and exchange beyond borders. Though grounded in native soil, the warrior class was never entirely insular. Through trade, conflict, diplomacy, and pilgrimage, they encountered and absorbed outside influences. New weapons, ideas, and philosophies tested their worldview, sometimes reinforcing their values, sometimes reshaping them. Their interactions with other civilizations reveal how warfare, culture, and identity evolved through exposure to the unfamiliar. One of the most immediate ways warriors engaged with the wider world was through trade routes, where goods often came with stories. Foreign merchants carried not only silks and spices, but also stories of distant kingdoms, different gods, and unfamiliar tactics. Warrior elites paid attention. They noted how foreign armies fought, how cities were fortified abroad, and what gear was being used by others. It was not uncommon for armor, helmets, or blades of foreign design to appear among the warrior class, adapted and refined for domestic use. Diplomacy provided another key channel. Envoys were received with ceremony and caution. Warriors acting as emissaries had to be skilled not just in politics, but in reading unspoken cues, body language, choice of gift, even silence could carry layered meaning. Negotiations with neighboring states or distant empires were delicate affairs where a single insult could provoke war. The warrior's code, emphasizing honor and control, provided a foundation for these delicate exchanges during military campaigns. Abroad, warriors often came face to face with foreign tactics. Some of these encounters led to innovation. When faced with unfamiliar cavalry formations, siege weaponry, or naval tactics, warriors responded by developing new strategies or incorporating foreign techniques. The adaptability of the warrior class became one of its strengths. Religious pilgrimages also offered exposure to other ways of life. Sacred sites beyond their borders were sometimes visited by warriors seeking enlightenment, penance, or divine guidance. In these travels, they encountered monks, priests, and sages from other traditions. Some of their own teachings were challenged, others deepened. Spiritual syncretism quietly took place, even as public rituals remained strictly traditional. Art and literature also reflected this outward gaze. Paintings began to depict foreign styles of clothing and armor, suggesting both curiosity and admiration. Scrolls were copied that described wars in distant lands or philosophies of leadership unfamiliar to local practice. These texts were studied in elite circles and incorporated into warrior education. Language, too, evolved through contact. Warriors who traveled or hosted foreigners began to incorporate foreign terms into their vocabulary, especially those related to tactics or technology. Translators became valued members of warrior households, acting as bridges between cultures. Some even married into foreign families, forming lasting bonds. One lesser-known aspect of this cultural blending was culinary. Warriors returning from distant posts brought back new cooking methods, spices, or preservation techniques. Meals, a central part of warrior hospitality and ceremony, reflected these influences over time. A new flavor on a noble's plate might trace its origin to a battlefield far from home. Through marriage alliances, warriors sometimes tied their fates to foreign nobility. These unions were political, but they also brought cultural exchange into the most intimate spaces of the household. Children of these unions grew up with dual identities, embodying the fusion of different warrior traditions. These mixed heritage families often became pioneers of innovation, able to draw from two or more cultural toolkits. Perhaps the most transformative exchanges came not through victory, but through defeat. Warriors who were captured or who retreated from foreign battlefields often returned humbled, changed by the experience. Their understanding of themselves, their enemies, and the nature of conflict matured. In reflection, they reevaluated what truly made a warrior. Was it brute strength, tactical brilliance, or something subtler, like adaptability and empathy? Historical records and chronicles contain instances where entire military doctrines shifted because of foreign exposure. Ideas about fortification, the use of cavalry, or psychological warfare were often borrowed, rebranded, and then taught as local strategy. This borrowing was not seen as weakness, but as evidence of wisdom, of the warrior's refusal to stagnate. In later centuries, with the rise of global exploration, the warrior's curiosity about the world expanded. Maps were drawn with greater accuracy, distant ports recorded in journals, and the idea of the warrior broadened to include not only the defender of territory, but the student of humanity. The warrior's shield was no longer just physical. It was cultural resilience in a world of shifting tides. Today, we see remnants of this legacy in multicultural martial arts systems, international military collaborations, and the global philosophy of service, sacrifice, and honor. The warrior abroad was not merely a traveler or conqueror. He was a listener, a learner, and a bridge between worlds. Through his openness to change, he preserved the very tradition he carried, proving that strength lies not in isolation, but in the wisdom to grow through connection. Through trade, conflict, diplomacy, and pilgrimage, they encountered and absorbed outside influences. New weapons, ideas, and philosophies tested their worldview, sometimes reinforcing their values, sometimes reshaping them. This chapter explores how contact with foreign cultures shaped the warrior's evolution. Chapter 24. The Warrior's Mind, Psychology, Fear, and Inner Battles. Beneath the armor and the calm exterior, the warrior battled fear, doubt, and trauma. To many, warriors appeared as paragons of fearlessness and stoicism, but the internal world of these individuals was often far more complex and vulnerable than their hardened exteriors suggested. Understanding the emotional and psychological dimensions of the warrior's experience offers a vital perspective on their humanity and resilience. From early youth, warriors were trained not only in physical disciplines, but also in mental fortitude. The endurance of pain, hunger, isolation, and stress was not merely incidental. It was core to the training philosophy. Trainees were subjected to long periods of deprivation, exposed to the elements, and taught to suppress pain. These rituals of hardship were designed not only to prepare the body, but to condition the mind to endure the chaos of war. Yet even the most prepared mind could be shaken by the brutal realities of battle. The sight of death, the sounds of suffering, and the weight of loss could haunt warriors long after the clash ended. Sleeplessness, mood swings, nightmares, and guilt were common but rarely discussed. Warriors were expected to carry these burdens silently. Emotional vulnerability was often mistaken for weakness, and the culture of silence around trauma created invisible wounds. Some warriors, however, developed personal rituals to process their internal conflicts. Meditation, breathing exercises, and solitary reflection were common among those who sought peace of mind. Writing poetry, painting, or even practicing calligraphy allowed for expression in controlled, private forms. Through art and quiet contemplation, warriors could give shape to their grief, fear, and uncertainty without risking public shame. Elders and mentors played a critical role in managing the mental health of younger warriors. It was often the responsibility of a seasoned veteran to help a novice understand not just the tactics of war, but its psychological costs. These mentors served as moral anchors, helping younger warriors process killing, loss, and the difficult decisions they faced. Their wisdom provided context and reassurance that fear was not failure, and that resilience was built, not inherited. Religion and spirituality also served as coping mechanisms. Belief in higher powers, fate, or reincarnation allowed many warriors to interpret suffering through a cosmic lens. Death was not the end, but a transition. Dreams and omens were taken seriously, and many warriors sought divine signs before battle. Faith provided comfort, but also discipline, guiding behavior through moral and metaphysical expectations. Group rituals helped foster solidarity and diffuse individual anguish. Communal meals, ceremonial chants, and group oaths reminded warriors that they were part of something larger than themselves. This shared identity helped reduce feelings of isolation and reinforced a sense of purpose. Even in grief, warriors were rarely alone. They mourned together, supported each other, and kept the memories of fallen comrades alive. Despite these supports, many warriors still carried trauma that lasted a lifetime. The concept of the invisible wound was recognized, even if not named. Warriors who had witnessed intense violence or who had been forced to commit morally ambiguous acts often struggled with guilt and confusion. Some withdrew from society, becoming monks or hermits. Others became aggressive or lost interest in family and duty. The psychological impact of warfare was as lasting as any physical injury. there was also the pressure of legacy. Warriors not only carried their own burdens, but also those of their lineage, living up to the deeds of ancestors, or surpassing the expectations of mentors created a psychological strain that could lead to burnout or disillusionment. The fear of disgrace loomed constantly. One misstep could tarnish a family's name for generations. Ironically, one of the greatest sources of fear among warriors was not death, but shame. Dishonor, cowardice, or betrayal were seen as fates, worse than mortality. This internalized code could be both a source of strength and a cruel judge, offering no forgiveness for human imperfection. In extreme cases, it led warriors to choose death over failure. In later life, some warriors found peace through teaching. Passing on their lessons to students became a form of healing. By helping others avoid their mistakes or understand their struggles, veterans gave purpose to their pain. Their testimonies became bridges across generations, offering younger warriors not only skills but insight into the cost of those skills. Today, the psychological legacy of the warrior continues to inform modern understandings of mental health. In military and civilian life, post-traumatic stress, moral injury, and resilience training are now openly studied and addressed. The Stoic silence once expected has given way to a new code, one that values honesty, vulnerability, and healing. Thus, the true strength of the warrior was not in denying fear, but in facing it. It was not in never falling, but in always rising. The warrior's mind was a battlefield of its own, filled with ghosts, doubts, and dreams. Yet it was also a source of compassion, insight, and unbreakable will. By understanding their inner battles, we honor not only what warriors did, but who they were and who they still are in all who fight with courage, clarity, and conscience. This chapter delves into the mental and emotional toll of the warrior's life, how they coped, how they hid pain, and how they found strength in vulnerability. Understanding their inner world reveals a more complete portrait of their humanity. Chapter 25: Legends and Myth. The warrior in story and song. Beyond history lies myth. Songs, plays, and legends elevated real warriors into symbols of the impossible. These stories served not only to entertain, but to instruct, preserve values, and inspire the next generation. The line between man and myth blurred in these tales, leaving behind larger-than-life figures that defined cultural imagination. Warriors whose feats transcended the battlefield became figures in epic poems, folk songs, and theatrical performances. Their actions, often exaggerated or stylized, carried lessons about courage, loyalty, sacrifice, and cunning. A single skirmish could be transformed into a heroic last stand, and a passing comment might be turned into a timeless aphorism. These legends were essential in constructing a shared identity for warrior societies. They were recited to children, chanted by troops before battle, and inscribed on monuments. Whether the tales were rooted in truth or entirely fictional, they provided emotional fuel. Warriors drew strength from these narratives, modeling their own behavior on the exploits of mythical predecessors. The role of the storyteller, bard, poet, or playwright was crucial in this cultural transmission. They were not merely entertainers, but curators of collective memory. Their task was to inspire awe, provoke thought, and preserve the unspoken truths of war. That heroism often comes at great cost, that fear is universal, and that legacy matters. More than longevity, one common theme was the lone warrior, outnumbered but unyielding. This figure represented not just martial prowess, but moral clarity. He fought not for glory, but for principle. His fall, if it came, was framed as a victory of spirit over circumstance. Such stories emphasize the internal code that guided warriors, reinforcing values even as they mourned loss. Another archetype was the flawed hero, the warrior who struggled with pride, anger, or doubt. These tales offered cautionary insights that strength without wisdom can be dangerous, and that even the greatest fighters must answer to their conscience. These myths humanized warriors, reminding audiences that mistakes were part of the journey. Myths also linked warriors with supernatural forces. Some were said to be born under auspicious stars, trained by spirits in dreams, or protected by ancestral blessings. These elements elevated the warrior's mission beyond the mundane, casting it as part of a divine or cosmic struggle. Belief in these stories helped justify decisions and offered solace in chaos. Battlefield omens and prophecies were a recurring motif. A warrior might hear a crow cry before a duel or dream of a falling blossom the night before an ambush. Interpreting these signs became a psychological exercise, deepening the warrior's awareness, intuition, and readiness. Whether real or imagined, such moments shaped choices and fortified resolve. Warriors themselves became storytellers in later life. Veterans would recount battles with increasing grandeur, not to deceive, but to enshrine meaning. Their memories, filtered through time and pain, became sacred tales. These stories were not judged by factual accuracy, but by emotional truth, what they revealed about bravery, love, regret, and the human condition. The rise of theatrical forms gave new life to warrior myths. On stage, actors in elaborate costume reenacted decisive battles, noble suicides, and fateful oaths. These performances drew on deep cultural memory, transforming historical events into communal rituals. Audiences cried, cheered, and reflected. Myth became more than narrative. It became ceremony. Art and sculpture also participated in this myth-making. Carvings depicted duels, last stands, and heavenly ascents. Paintings showed warriors astride rearing horses or walking alone into a setting sun. These images hung in halls, temples, and homes, reminding all who passed of the values they represented. To see a warrior was to be reminded of duty. Women, too, featured in these myths, sometimes as warriors themselves, sometimes as grieving widows, devoted sisters, or wise counselors. Their roles offered emotional depth and broadened the moral landscape. Through them, myths taught not just how to fight, but how to feel, forgive, and endure. With time, these stories evolved, merging with new cultural narratives and adapting to contemporary concerns. In times of war, they were sharpened. For morale, in peace, softened into moral parables. Yet they never vanished. Even in modern films, literature, and digital media, echoes of these myths persist. Today, the legacy of warrior myth remains a source of guidance and inspiration. In a world often overwhelmed by complexity, the clear values and epic stakes of mythic stories offer clarity. They teach us to dream boldly, act honorably, and stand firm in the face of adversity. Thus, legend and myth were not distractions from the warrior's life. They were its deepest expression. In story and song, the warrior became immortal, not because he could not die, but because his spirit could not be forgotten. Songs, plays, and legends elevated real warriors into symbols of the impossible. These stories served not only to entertain, but to instruct, preserve values, and inspire the next generation. The line between man and myth blurred in these tales, leaving behind larger-than-life figures that defined cultural imagination. Chapter 26. The Warrior and the Artisan. Crafting the tools of purpose. That a warrior's weapon was more than a tool. It was a symbol of identity, care, and craft. The bond between a warrior and his equipment reflected not only functionality, but philosophy. Weapons, armor, and ceremonial gear were extensions of the self, and their creation was entrusted to artisans of exceptional skill and spiritual awareness. These craftsmen were not merely workers. They were partners in purpose, shaping the tools through which a warrior expressed duty, loyalty, and power. The sword, perhaps the most iconic emblem of the warrior, required months to forge properly. Blacksmiths used precise techniques passed down over generations. The folding of steel was not only a method for refining strength and flexibility, but also a ritual of purification. Each layer represented a step toward perfection. During forging, smiths often recited prayers or worked in silence, believing that their mindset would transfer into the weapon's essence. Warriors would often visit the forge personally, participating in rituals to bless the blade. These ceremonies created a spiritual bond between the user and the weapon, treating it not as a lifeless tool, but as a trusted companion. Some warriors gave names to their swords, composed poems for them, or stored them in special shrines when not in use. In this context, the sword became a living symbol of honor, sacrifice, and personal philosophy. Armor, too, was a marriage of form and function. Tailored to the individual, it had to balance protection with freedom of movement. Artisans created elaborate designs using leather, silk cords, and metal plates, each element harmonizing with the others to provide flexibility, durability, and aesthetic dignity. Armor was often decorated with family crests, symbols of past victories, or spiritual motifs intended to ward off harm. The process of crafting armor was deeply collaborative. Artisans consulted with warriors about battlefield conditions, body shape, and fighting style. Adjustments were made through trials and feedback. This iterative process ensured that the armor was not only protective, but also a true reflection of the wearer's identity. The result was not mass-produced uniformity, but custom-built masterpieces, each telling a personal story. Other tools, bows, arrows, spears, and saddles, also received careful attention. Archers worked closely with fletchers to select arrow shafts, balance tips, and calibrate strings. Each detail affected range, accuracy, and reliability. Saddle makers considered posture, weight distribution, and long-distance comfort. Even the horse's gear was fitted with respect and foresight, as the animal's performance could determine the battle's outcome. Ceremonial items were crafted with equal reverence. Helmets for parades, robes for rituals, or swords used in oath-taking were adorned with intricate designs and made from rare materials. These objects were more than beautiful. They served as markers of rank, legacy, and purpose. The craftsmen behind them were chosen for their ability to balance spiritual depth with technical excellence. Artisans themselves held a respected place in society. Though not warriors by trade, they understood war's demands and psychology. Their workshops became hubs of both innovation and tradition, places where the values of discipline, patience, and integrity flourished. Young apprentices learned not just how to mold metal or stitch silk, but how to carry themselves with dignity and mindfulness. Some artisans specialized in restoring heirloom weapons and armor. This task was considered sacred. Cleaning, reshaping, and reforging allowed ancient objects to continue serving new generations. The act of preservation was seen as a dialogue between past and present, ensuring that ancestral wisdom lived on through functional legacy. The aesthetic choices made by artisans also carried weight. Certain color patterns, animal motifs, or materials signified alliances, personal virtues, or ancestral lineage. In a world where symbolism mattered, even the curve of a blade or the design of a crest could signal peace, aggression, or divine favor. Visual cues communicated messages on and off the battlefield. Interestingly, some warriors became artisans in later life. Having mastered destruction, they turned to creation. These individuals forged blades, painted armor, or crafted ceremonial tokens, imbuing them with the emotional depth only experience could bring. Their work often bore a maturity and clarity that younger craftsmen admired. Today, the legacy of warrior artisans continues. Museums display weapons not as artifacts of violence, but as works of art and culture. Modern blacksmiths study ancient techniques, martial artists revere the feel of well-balanced weapons, and collectors seek out historically significant armor. The dialogue between warrior and artisan remains active, a testament to the enduring value of collaboration, craftsmanship, and respect. Thus, the tools of the warrior were more than instruments of war. They were products of patience, vision, and deep emotional investment. Behind every victorious strike was a smith's fire, a fletcher's eye, and a tailor's steady hand. Through this synergy, the warrior and the artisan achieved something lasting, an unspoken alliance between creation and courage, form and function, soul and steel. This chapter highlights the artisans who forged swords, stitched armor, and crafted ceremonial gear. Their collaboration with warriors represented a bond of trust and a union of form and function that bridged the world of creation and combat. Chapter 27. The Warrior's Legacy in Law and Justice. Justice was not a philosophical concept for the warrior. It was a code to be lived and enforced. The principles of law, fairness, and righteous order were deeply embedded in the worldview of those who upheld both the sword and the scale. The warrior's transition from battlefield tactician to peacetime magistrate was neither rare nor unnatural. Rather, it represented the extension of their discipline and moral clarity into the civic realm. The warrior's sense of law was both practical and spiritual, rooted in lived experience and a desire to prevent future conflict. In many historical contexts, warriors were appointed as local judges and governors, entrusted with the responsibility of resolving disputes, managing land rights, and enforcing codes of conduct. Their authority was respected not just because of their military prowess, but because of their perceived impartiality and wisdom. It was assumed that one who had seen death up close would value life, order, and community stability all the more. Dispute resolution often took place in public forums, with the warrior judge listening carefully to all sides. The emphasis was on clarity, brevity, and truthfulness. Elaborate arguments were frowned upon unless they served to reveal a deeper moral or factual truth. Warriors prized straightforwardness and detested manipulation. Their decisions were expected to reflect both legal precedent and the moral ethos of the community. Codes of justice evolved from the battlefield ethos: honor, responsibility, loyalty, and restitution. Punishments were not always physical. A warrior might sentence an offender to public apology, community service, or symbolic restitution, such as planting trees or restoring a shrine, if it would restore harmony and teach humility. The goal was not vengeance, but rebalancing. Land disputes were among the most common and volatile issues brought before warrior magistrates. Given the importance of land ownership to status, livelihood, and inheritance, conflicts could escalate quickly. Warriors, trained in strategic thinking and risk assessment, applied those skills to mediation. They considered long-term consequences, emotional stakes, and familial dynamics, often negotiating settlements that preserved honor for all parties. In cases of criminal behavior, murder, theft, treason, the warrior's sense of justice was swift but deliberate. They believed in punishment as a deterrent, but also in the possibility of redemption. A warrior found guilty of betrayal might be given a chance to reclaim honor through a dangerous mission or personal sacrifice. Those who refused such paths were shunned or exiled, their names stricken from official records. Warrior courts were also responsible for maintaining codes of conduct within their ranks. Challenges to authority, acts of cowardice, or breaches of discipline were handled internally, often with severe consequences. Yet fairness remained paramount. A commander who abused his power could be removed by peer judgment. Even leaders were expected to embody the justice they enforced. Warriors also played a role in drafting and preserving legal documents. These scrolls outlined treaties, military obligations, land transfers, and oaths of allegiance. Because many warriors were literate and trained in rhetoric, their legal writing was both poetic and precise. They believed that law should be beautiful in form and strong in spirit. Education in legal matters became part of warrior training. Young initiates studied past judgments, learned key ethical dilemmas, and debated hypothetical cases. This was not mere academic exercise, it was moral preparation. Warriors were taught that enforcing the law required inner clarity and emotional maturity. They had to be as skilled in listening as they were in striking. Spiritual practices also informed warrior justice. Before rendering judgment, some would pray, meditate, or seek signs from ancestors. Temples were sometimes used as courts, lending sanctity to proceedings. This merging of spiritual and legal authority reminded all present that law was not simply man-made. It reflected a higher order. The warriors' involvement in justice also extended to international matters. In diplomacy, they negotiated treaties that balanced power with ethics. In war tribunals, they judged conduct based on agreed norms of engagement. Their presence lent legitimacy to processes that might otherwise have seemed arbitrary or political. In modern times, the legacy of the warrior judge survives in military courts, ethical codes of conduct, and legal traditions grounded in honor. The idea that justice must be served not only fairly but with dignity remains a cornerstone of legal philosophy in many parts of the world. Thus, the warrior's blade may have defended the people, but his sense of justice preserved the peace. Through law, warriors transitioned from protectors of territory to protectors of harmony. Their legacy reminds us that true strength lies not only in the ability to strike, but in the wisdom to know when and how to restore balance. Many warriors became magistrates and lawmakers. This chapter traces the warrior's influence on legal traditions, dispute resolution, and the balance between fairness and loyalty. Chapter 28. The Warrior as Builder. Architecture, cities, and infrastructure. Castles and strongholds tell a story of strategic brilliance and cultural pride. Warriors oversaw the building of roads, walls, and entire communities. Their sense of permanence and foresight helped shape landscapes and cities that still stand today. Architecture became a form of silent expression and strength. While war demanded destruction, warriors also committed themselves to construction. They built not only fortresses and gates, but also bridges, waterworks, and shrines. These were not mere symbols of control. They were manifestations of vision, endurance, and collective effort. A well-built citadel could resist invaders for generations, while a neglected one could fall within hours. Warriors understood that battles might be won in a moment, but legacies were built over lifetimes. Early fortifications were simple palisades of wood or stone, positioned on hills or riverbanks. Over time, these evolved into complex, multi-tiered citadels, complete with moats, ramparts, and layered defenses. A warrior's understanding of terrain deeply influenced castle placement. A curve in a river, the slope of a mountain, or the direction of prevailing winds could all become elements of defense. Their designs demonstrated a synergy between human intention and natural advantage. Construction was a communal event. Warriors coordinated with artisans, farmers, laborers, and spiritual leaders. Every role was seen as vital. Stone cutters worked beside generals. Blacksmiths collaborated with carpenters. The labor was strenuous, but the goal, stability and pride, united them. Successful builds were celebrated with feasts and rituals, emphasizing that what they created would serve generations. City walls protected not only homes, but identities. Inside, streets were laid with precision. Warriors often enforced codes of cleanliness and fire prevention, understanding that public health was essential to civic strength. They regulated markets, ensured food storage, and even designated places for learning, prayer, and play. They understood that a strong city needed more than defense. It required vitality. Temples and shrines, often funded or protected by warrior families, were built to anchor spiritual life. These sacred sites were aligned with stars, seasons, and sacred geometry. Warriors believed that a city's protection depended as much on divine favor as on military readiness. Shrines at gates, crossings, and high points served as both watchtowers and sanctuaries. Infrastructure also reflected warrior priorities. Roads were widened to allow troop movement, but they also facilitated trade and cultural exchange. Bridges, often elaborately decorated, symbolized connection, not just between places, but between peoples. Aqueducts and irrigation systems nourished crops and supported large urban populations. These were silent engines of civilization, powered by foresight and protected by sword. Architectural aesthetics held meaning beyond beauty. Materials were chosen not only for durability, but for symbolism. Wood suggested humility, stone permanence, gold transcendence. Rooflines echoed mountains, and floor plans mirrored constellations. Warriors believed that harmony in architecture led to harmony in society. Many architectural innovations were driven by military necessity. Trapdoors, false walls, arrow slits, and hidden corridors became standard in elite homes and castles. But the same creativity was applied to civilian needs. Emergency exits in schools, granaries with ventilation systems, and shelters for the poor reflected a vision that peace required design as much as policy. In addition to defense and functionality, architecture was used to inspire. Towering gates, massive halls, and ceremonial platforms conveyed majesty. Visitors entering such spaces felt awe, not of the ruler, but of the community's spirit. Warriors knew that structure could speak where words failed. A stone tower did not merely declare power. It invited participation in a greater storied peace spread. Many warriors became patrons of artful construction. Gardens with symbolic pathways, libraries with preserved scrolls, and theaters for epic storytelling emerged. These spaces honored past struggles and envisioned futures of unity. Warriors taught that building wisely was an act of compassion. Children played in streets warriors paved. Elders prayed in halls they raised. Lovers met on balconies they designed. In every life moment, the imprint of the warrior builder endured. Their influence stretched beyond their time, laying foundations for cities that remained vibrant long after their names faded. Thus, the warrior was not only a breaker of siege lines, but a builder of lifelines. Through architecture and infrastructure, he carved stability from stone, drew community from timber, and etched hope into the very skyline. The builder's strength lay not only in fortification but in imagination, in seeing what could be raised long after the sword was sheathed. Chapter 29. The Warrior and the Healer, Medicine, Recovery, and Renewal. While warriors are most commonly associated with strength, combat, and confrontation, another essential chapter of their legacy lies in their relationship with healing. The battlefield was a place of chaos and destruction, but within that destruction emerged a deep need for care, recovery, and physical renewal. The warrior and the healer stood on opposite ends of the human spectrum, one breaking and one mending. Yet, they often stood side by side, their purposes intertwined. Every seasoned warrior knew the importance of recovery. After battle, wounds were assessed not just for survival, but for long-term ability to serve. A cut arm was not just a laceration, it was a threat to swordsmanship. A shattered leg could end a mounted warrior's career. Thus, healers were not seen as secondary figures, but as critical to a warrior's effectiveness and longevity. Healers served on the battlefield, in fortresses, and in traveling retinues. Their tools were as varied as their techniques. Herbs, compresses, heated blades for cauterization, poultices for infection, and bone-setting splints. Many carried satchels filled with medicinal roots, salves, dried fungi, and hand-copied medical texts. They operated by touch, intuition, and accumulated knowledge passed down through oral and written tradition. Training to be a healer was as rigorous as martial training. Apprentices spent years studying anatomy, observing surgeries, foraging for ingredients, and learning the pulse of a body in pain. A miscalculation could lead to death. A successful intervention could return a warrior to battle and glory. Over time, healers were trusted as much as commanders. Warriors learned to follow their advice, and many developed lifelong bonds with the hands that saved them. The relationship between healer and warrior was deeply respectful. Some warriors believed that a wound bound them spiritually to the healer, who closed it. Others saw recovery not only as a physical event, but as a moral transformation. To be wounded was to face mortality. To be healed was to be reborn with gratitude, clarity, and sometimes even newfound humility. Spiritual rituals often accompanied the healing process. Priests and monks were called upon to bless healing spaces, chant for recovery, or guide the soul of a warrior who hovered between life and death. Incense, talismans, and sacred texts adorned treatment areas. These acts offered not only hope, but a reminder that healing was part of a larger cosmic order. The concept of preventative care was also embraced. Seasoned warriors engaged in practices to strengthen the body and prevent illness: stretching, breathing exercises, herbal tonics, massage therapy, and meditation. These were not luxuries. They were seen as disciplines, just like sword drills or horseback riding. A warrior's health was their foundation. Mental health was likewise acknowledged, even if not openly discussed. Healers recognized signs of emotional distress, nightmares, fatigue, rage, or melancholy. While vocabulary around trauma was limited, its presence was undeniable. Compassionate healers offered rest, prayer, or periods of seclusion for warriors who bore invisible wounds. Some even developed specialized practices of guided conversation, dream interpretation, or song therapy to aid recovery. Women played a significant role in healing. As mothers, midwives, herbalists, and field medics, they often acted as both caregivers and advisors. Their deep understanding of cycles, bodily, emotional, and seasonal, gave them insight that warriors relied upon. In many cases, Female healers were the first and last people a warrior saw before and after battle. In times of plague or widespread illness, warrior leaders coordinated with healer networks to contain outbreaks, distribute supplies, and maintain morale. It was understood that without healthy citizens, no military force could function. The art of war and the science of healing worked in tandem to protect communities. Some warriors eventually became healers themselves. After decades of battle, they turned to the preservation of life rather than its taking. They passed down battlefield first aid, taught anatomy through the lens of injury, and explored how hands once used for killing could now mend. These transformations were often seen as redemptive, a closing of the warrior's circle. Healers also had to heal themselves. The emotional weight of tending to the wounded, seeing death, and sometimes failing to save lives required incredible strength. Support networks existed among healer communities, often centered around shared rituals, songs, or periods of retreat. Modern parallels abound. Veterans turned doctors, soldiers turned therapists, and martial artists who now teach healing. Arts all embody this dual legacy. The wisdom of balancing destruction with restoration continues. We see its echoes in hospitals built like sanctuaries, in rehabilitation programs guided by discipline, and in the moral courage of those who choose to mend rather than break. Thus, the warrior and the healer are not opposites. They are reflections. One tests the body, the other restores it. One risks life, the other preserves it. In their unity lies the full arc of human resilience. To study one without the other is to miss half the truth. Together, they form a complete story, a story of strength tempered by compassion and courage sustained through care. Chapter 30. The Warrior and the Philosopher. Ethics, Reflection, and the Pursuit of Wisdom. Though trained in warfare, many warriors sought a deeper understanding of life, justice, and the human spirit. Philosophy was not a luxury, it was a necessity. In a world where choices could mean life or death, warriors turned to ethical codes, introspection, and spiritual texts to guide their actions and maintain their integrity. The warrior's life was a constant confrontation with mortality. Each battle could be the last. This awareness led many to seek meaning beyond the sword. They engaged in philosophical dialogues, read spiritual manuscripts, and practiced reflection. Wisdom was seen as the highest form of strength, a way to maintain honor amidst chaos. From early training, warriors were taught more than how to fight. They were taught how to think. Instructors posed moral dilemmas, challenging students to consider the right course of action even in situations where outcomes were unclear or consequences severe. Questions like, when is mercy more powerful than vengeance? Or what makes a cause just? Were not theoretical, they were grounded in lived reality. This emphasis on ethics fostered self-discipline. Warriors learned to restrain not only their hands but their hearts. Rage had to be tempered with reason. Fear had to yield to duty. Arrogance had to bow before responsibility. In cultivating these virtues, warriors distinguished themselves not merely as fighters, but as custodians of a moral code. Written works on philosophy circulated widely among warrior households. Texts explored topics such as impermanence, humility, duty, and balance. They offered strategies for emotional regulation, insight into leadership, and models for ethical living. Some warriors even kept personal journals, writing down their reflections on battle, loss, victory, and the fleeting nature of glory. Silence and solitude were often used for reflection. Warriors would retreat to mountaintops, riversides, or temple grounds to contemplate their place in the world. They observed the changing seasons, the behavior of animals, the patterns of stars. From nature, they derived lessons in endurance, grace, and the cyclical nature of life. Dialogue with others also played a critical role in the philosophical lives of warriors. Trusted friends, mentors, and spiritual guides offered perspectives that challenged assumptions and broadened understanding. These conversations were not about debate. They were about seeking truth and maintaining clarity in an ever-changing world. Warriors saw death not as defeat, but as a teacher. They studied the stories of fallen comrades not only to analyze tactics, but to understand choices and consequences. They asked, what does it mean to live well? What makes a death meaningful? These reflections shaped how they approached their missions, treated their enemies, and governed their people. Leadership was considered the highest test of philosophy. A warrior in command had to weigh the needs of many, balance justice with compassion, and maintain calm in crisis. Those who led without wisdom risked becoming tyrants. Those who ruled with humility and insight earned lasting respect. Warriors also used philosophy to resist corruption. Surrounded by temptation, power, wealth, fame, they relied on inner convictions to stay grounded. Stories abound of warriors who turned down bribes, protected the innocent at personal cost, or retired to a life of simplicity after achieving great power. Their strength was rooted not just in skill, but in self-knowledge. Art and philosophy often merged in the warriors' world. Poems, paintings, and garden design were seen as forms of inquiry. Creating beauty was a way to understand and influence the inner self. A well-composed verse or a perfectly raked garden path expressed clarity of thought and intention, reflecting the harmony warriors sought in their actions. The legacy of the philosophical warrior remains relevant. In modern times, military ethics, leadership training, and personal development all draw from ancient warrior philosophies. Books, speeches, and films continue to portray the warrior as a thinker and seeker, not just a combatant. This image inspires people in all walks of life to approach their struggles with dignity, awareness, and moral purpose. Thus, the warrior and the philosopher are not two paths, they are one. The hand that wields the sword must also guide the mind. Strength without wisdom is tyranny. Wisdom without strength is impotence. Together, they form a whole human being, capable of defending what is right and understanding why it matters. In seeking wisdom, the warrior completes his journey, not in conquest, but in the mastery of self.